Most people think of submarines as sleek, nimble vessels slipping silently through deep waters like shadows beneath the waves. But the truth is far more complex, and in some cases, far stranger. The largest submarines ever built by Nazi Germany weren't built to hunt alone in the darkness. They were engineered to seed the ocean itself with instruments of destruction, moving through waters with the deliberate patience of underwater farmers planting a mechanized crop. These vessels, the Type XB Minelayers, represented a departure from everything conventional submarine doctrine had taught, a gamble on size and capability that would define an entire chapter of submarine warfare that few people remember today. Picture, if you will, a northern harbor on the North Sea just before dawn breaks. The water is still, almost glass-like, broken only by the gentlest of ripples. Mist clings to the concrete and steel in thick veils, obscuring the tops of enormous structures that rise from the docks like sleeping giants. The air smells of salt, diesel fuel, and something older, the mineral scent of worked metal and cold ocean spray. Here, in the growing pale light, lie the U-boat pens. Massive reinforced bunkers stretch along the quays, their concrete roofs thick enough to resist any bomb that the Allies might drop. Inside these cavernous spaces, secured in the shadows, are submarines of unusual proportion. Their hulls are broader than most, their silhouettes longer, their purposes more ambitious than the standard attack boats everyone has come to know from history books. The men who walk these docks in the early morning hours move with a quiet purpose. Their footsteps echo slightly off the wet concrete. Some carry clipboards and thermos flasks of warm coffee. Others perform their daily inspections, running their hands along the cold steel, checking rivets, examining the countless systems that must function in perfect synchronization for these machines to survive beneath the sea. The light is still weak enough that you can't quite see clearly more than 50 meters ahead. The mist swirls in lazy patterns, gathering in pockets, dispersing just as slowly. There is no urgency in this moment. There is no panic or emergency. There is only the quiet, methodical routine of preparation that precedes some of the war's most unusual naval undertakings. This is the world of the Type XB Minelayer, a world that exists in the margins of World War II history, not because it was unimportant, but because so few people have ventured into its depths to understand what made these boats remarkable, what made them feared, and what ultimately made them expendable. These submarines represented years of technical innovation, bold strategic thinking, and extraordinary engineering. They required crew members who possessed not just courage, but an ability to function in spaces so confined that a grown man could barely stretch his arms in certain compartments. They demanded captains with nerves of iron, capable of making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between returning home and resting permanently on the ocean floor. If you've ever wondered about the hidden chapters of submarine warfare, or if the technical details of how a submarine plants hundreds of mines across hundreds of miles of open ocean has intrigued you, then I'd like to invite you to subscribe to Fall Asleep to The Complete History of the Type XB Minelayer, Germany's largest U-boat. Over the course of this documentary, we'll trace these remarkable vessels from their conceptual origins through their final, often tragic fates. We'll meet the men who built them, the officers who commanded them, and the crews who served aboard them in circumstances that tested human endurance in ways that deserve to be remembered and understood. Now, as the morning deepens slightly and more figures begin to move across the harbor, let us step back further still, not in space, but in time. We must return to the years before these boats were ever conceived, to a moment when Germany was a nation stripped of its military power, bound by treaties that seemed to prohibit the very existence of submarines. We must understand the desperation, the ingenuity, and the quiet determination that led German engineers and strategists to imagine that such vessels could ever be built at all. The world that emerged from the First World War was one of profound restriction and resentment. Germany, defeated and humiliated, found itself subject to the Treaty of Versailles, a document so punitive in its terms that it would echo through the next 2 decades with consequences no one fully anticipated. The submarine arm, which had come so close to strangling British commerce in the final years of the Great War, was to be eliminated entirely. No submarines, none whatsoever. The German Navy, once a formidable force that had challenged British supremacy, was reduced to a coastal defense force with a handful of surface ships. It was a treaty written by victors who had learned, through bitter experience, what German underwater warfare could accomplish. And yet, even as this document was being signed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, German minds were already turning toward ways to circumvent it. The years of the Weimar Republic were years of humiliation and economic chaos, but they were also years of hidden preparation. In shipyards that were theoretically forbidden from building submarines, German engineers began creating designs on paper. They studied the technical lessons of the U-boat campaign. They analyzed what had worked and what had failed. They conducted research into new materials, new propulsion systems, and new tactical approaches. This was all done in shadows and whispers, in rooms where doors were kept locked and conversations were conducted in the lowest tones. The international agreements were clear, but the determination to rebuild Germany's submarine capacity was equally resolute. And so, as the mist over that North Sea harbour continues to swirl in the pale morning light, we must understand that every steel hull lying in those pens represents not merely a military vessel, but the fulfillment of a dream that had been nurtured in secret for nearly 2 decades. The Type XB Minelayers were not born from nothing. They were the product of a specific lineage of submarine design, one that traced back to the earliest days of underwater warfare, to lessons learned and lessons nearly forgotten, to a vision of what submarines could accomplish if they were designed not to hunt merchant ships one at a time, but to transform entire stretches of ocean into killing fields. In those early morning hours, when the North Sea harbour lay dormant beneath its veil of mist, the enormous steel hulls of the U-boat pens cast shadows that seemed to stretch and contract with the fog itself. The water was perfectly still, so still it looked like darkened glass, and the only sounds were the distant cries of gulls and the barely perceptible creak of mooring lines pulling gently against their restraints. It was in this world of quiet steel and salt-laden air that an extraordinary submarine class was born and came of age, vessels unlike any others that prowled the Atlantic depths, designed not for the traditional hunt, but for a far more methodical and perhaps more devastating purpose. They were minelayers, the largest submarines Germany would ever build, and their story is one woven through with technical audacity, human endurance, and the strange quietness that comes when enormous machines move almost invisibly through the world. If the complete history of these remarkable boats intrigues you, the full chronicle of their design, their missions across 2 oceans, the intimate details of how their crews lived and what they endured, consider subscribing to follow this documentary to its deepest waters, where we'll explore not just the technical specifications and battle records, but the very human experience of men who served aboard Germany's largest U-boat, the Type XB Minelayer. Now, to truly understand how a submarine of such unprecedented size came to exist, we must step back from that misty harbour and travel backward in time, to an era when Germany itself was struggling to rebuild, when the very existence of a U-boat arm was a secret whispered in darkened rooms. The year was 1918, and the First World War had just ended. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crushing restrictions on German rearmament. No submarines were to be built, no U-boats were to roam the seas. It was a clause meant to cripple German naval power forever, a punishment written into international law. Yet, in the years that followed, something remarkable happened in German shipyards and in the minds of German naval architects. They began to plan in secret. They sketched designs on paper that would never be filed officially. They studied the lessons of the previous war with meticulous care, remembering which vessels had succeeded and which had failed, which tactics had proven most devastating and which had crumbled under pressure. Among these shadowy plans were sketches of mine-laying submarines, a concept that was not entirely new, but one that had never been pursued on such an ambitious scale. During the First World War, Germany had deployed a small number of mine-layers, boats of the UE class, vessels that had ventured far across the Atlantic and had sown their deadly gardens in the waters off America's eastern seaboard. These early mine-layers had demonstrated something extraordinary. A single submarine could, without firing a torpedo, without sinking a vessel in direct combat, cause immense disruption to an enemy's maritime trade. A field of mines, laid patiently and invisibly in the darkness, could choke shipping lanes for months. It could force convoys to take longer routes, could scatter merchant vessels, could instill a pervasive sense of danger in the waters that Allied ships were forced to traverse. The mines themselves were almost democratic in their destructiveness. They did not distinguish between warships and freighters, between the powerful and the vulnerable. They waited in the black depths, patient and impassive, until something heavy enough crossed their invisible boundary. This memory, this historical lesson learned in blood and salt water, never left the minds of the German naval planners. Why build conventional submarines, vessels designed to hunt and destroy with torpedoes, requiring constant vigilance and skilled crews to line up targets and execute attacks, when instead you could design a submarine that simply planted its deadly cargo and departed? There was an elegance to mine-laying, a kind of mathematical inevitability. The mines would do the work while the submarine disappeared into the vastness of the ocean. And so, throughout the 1930s, as Germany secretly rebuilt its U-boat arm in violation of treaty agreements, as designers worked in carefully compartmentalized offices and shipyards began tool up for submarine construction, the vision of a giant mine-laying submarine began to take shape. It would not be a swift attack boat. It would not prioritize maneuverability or speed. Instead, it would be built for range, for the ability to voyage to distant seas and to carry an unprecedented payload of mines in vertical shafts that would run the length of its hull. The men who designed this vessel were not dreamers or fantasists. They were methodical engineers who understood every constraint and every possibility of submarine design. They knew that a larger boat would be heavier, slower, and more vulnerable to detection. But they also understood that a larger boat could carry more fuel, travel farther, and transport far more cargo, including the mines that gave the class its distinctive character. They were willing to accept certain vulnerabilities in exchange for unprecedented capability. In some ways, this choice reflects a broader tension in naval design that has never been fully resolved. The eternal trade-off between power and evasion, between capability and concealment. A submarine that can do everything is a submarine that is probably not good at any single thing. The Type XB was designed with a philosophy that accepted this tension directly. It was built to be large. It was built to roam far. It was built to strike in a manner that was almost abstract, not with the flash and drama of a torpedo, but with the patient inevitability of a minefield slowly being discovered by an enemy who did not yet know it existed. By the late 1930s, as rearmament accelerated and as the probability of another war began to feel less like speculation and more like fact, the first of these extraordinary boats were laid down in the shipyards. The Germaniawerft in Kiel, one of Germany's most prestigious submarine builders, was tasked with their construction. In the years before the war, in that strange interval between peace and conflict, when the world still seemed to hold its breath, workers began to assemble the components that would make up the first Type XB boats. They would work in sections, as all submarine construction was done, riveting and welding steel plates into the shape of pressure hulls, installing the complex machinery that would drive these massive vessels through the depths. The first boats would be designated U-116 through U-119, and they would represent the culmination of everything Germany had learned about submarine design and mine-laying operations over more than 2 decades. When these boats finally slipped into the water and began their initial trials, they would represent something genuinely unprecedented in submarine history. The largest mine layers the world had ever seen, boats that carried not just the dreams of their designers, but also a kind of technological ambition that was almost audacious in its scope. What is it, one might wonder, that drives nations and designers to pursue such ambitious projects? Perhaps it is the simple human desire to build something larger than what has come before, to create something that will be remembered, to push against the boundaries of what is considered possible. Or perhaps it is something deeper, a recognition that warfare itself is changing, that the old methods of direct combat are becoming less viable, and that new, more subtle methods of disruption and destruction are taking their place. The Type XB Minelayers represent, in their own way, an acknowledgement of this shift. They are vessels designed not for the romance of naval combat, but for the methodical, patient work of making an enemy's waters dangerous. And in the darkness of the ocean depths, moving almost silently through waters that had become ever more contested and ever more perilous, these remarkable boats would write a chapter of submarine history that would not be fully understood or appreciated until decades after the war itself had ended. The treaty that ended the First World War did not end with a treaty, in a way. It ended with a wound, and in the years that followed, that wound would shape everything about how Germany dreamed of the sea again. In the early 1920s, the ink barely dry on the Treaty of Versailles, the victorious powers sat down to write the rules of what Germany was permitted to build, to own, and to dream of owning. And somewhere in those dense pages of naval restrictions, they tried to erase something that had very nearly won them the war: the U-boat. The German submarine arm, the Unterseebootwaffe, had become legendary and terrible in equal measure. For 4 years, these vessels had hunted the Atlantic with a hunger that threatened to starve Britain into surrender. Hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping lay on the ocean floor, sent down by the silent hunters that emerged from German ports. The British, the Americans, the French, all of them remembered this. All of them were determined it would never happen again. So Versailles did what seemed logical to the architects of peace. It forbade Germany from building submarines entirely. No U-boats, no submarine arm, no future beneath the waves. But forbidding and preventing are 2 very different things, aren't they? And Germany, chafing under the restrictions of a treaty that had taken its colonies, its territory, its dignity, began to think about what it might do in the shadows, in the spaces between the words of the agreement. Perhaps you've noticed that history often moves this way, not in bold declarations, but in small decisions made in rooms where important men lean close and speak softly about what the rest of the world might not quite notice. The Weimar Republic, fragile and struggling in the economic chaos of the early 1920s, maintained a surface compliance with Versailles. But beneath that surface, engineers and naval officers were thinking. They were remembering. They were planning. Germany could not build submarines openly, true, but what if other nations could? What if Germany found partners, foreign clients who might commission designs, might pay for construction, and from which Germany might learn? What if the knowledge, the expertise, the very possibility of the U-boat could be kept alive in exile, waiting. This was not paranoia or fantasy. This was deliberate strategy. German naval architects and submarine engineers began, quietly, to work with neutral nations. Some went to Sweden, others found their way to Spain, to Japan, to the Soviet Union in those early years before the ideological rupture became complete. They designed submarines under false names. They trained crews for other nations' navies. They kept the dream of the U-boat alive, not in Germany, but around its edges, in the spaces where the treaty's enforcers could not easily reach. And then something shifted. Something in the political weather changed. The early 1930s brought economic depression, and with depression came rage, and with rage came the rise of a movement that promised to undo the humiliation of Versailles. A man who had once been a failed artist, a German nationalist with a magnetic voice and a terrible vision, began to consolidate power. And one of the first things he understood, almost instinctively, was that German power would have to be built on the water as much as on land. In 1935, just 16 years after Versailles, Germany and Britain signed a naval agreement that shocked the world. On its surface, it was a modest thing, an agreement about tonnage, about percentages, about what types of ships each nation might build. But hidden within it was something extraordinary. It granted Germany the right to build submarines. To build submarines. After 2 decades of prohibition, after a treaty that had tried to write the U-boat out of existence, Germany suddenly had, through negotiation rather than violation, the legal permission to begin building again. The man in power, Adolf Hitler, understood the significance. He wanted a fleet that could challenge Britain's supremacy. But more than that, he wanted to reclaim something that had been taken. He wanted to prove that the treaty, that humiliation, that imposed helplessness, could be overcome. And the quickest way to do that was to rebuild the submarine arm that had nearly won the last war. The Naval High Command, the Oberkommando der Kriegsmarine, began to dust off old drawings. Engineers who had spent years in exile, designing boats for other nations, were called home. The machinery of industrial production, dormant for so long, began to turn over once more. But this time, the Kriegsmarine wanted more than simply to recreate what had been. They wanted to build better. They wanted to build larger, to build farther-ranging, to build with new technologies that the designers of the earlier boats could never have imagined. They wanted submarines that could hunt across oceans, that could stay at sea for months, that could deliver their weapons with precision and patience. And they wanted something unusual, something that would require a ship far larger than anything the world had yet seen in a submarine. They wanted a minelayer. The distinction might seem small, but it was profound. Most submarines hunted with torpedoes. They moved quickly, struck hard, and disappeared. But a minelayer was different. A minelayer laid its weapons deliberately, like a gardener planting seeds, waiting for the harvest of the enemy ships that would sail into its trap. It required space, vast space inside the hull for storing mines. It required range to travel far from home and to do so slowly, methodically, precisely. It required a submarine that was less a hunter and more a ghost, placing death in the waters where others would travel unaware. This was the Type XB, still unnamed, still merely an idea in the minds of engineers and admirals. It was a vision of something that had never quite been attempted before. A submarine so large that some observers, when they first saw the drawings, wondered if it had crossed some invisible line into a ship of a different kind altogether. The technical specifications alone suggested something almost paradoxical. A vessel that had to be enormous to carry its burden of mines, yet had to remain invisible to the eyes and instruments of a determined enemy. How could something so large hide so completely? How could something so powerful move so silently? These were the questions that drove the design, and they would haunt the boat throughout its life. The journey from Versailles to the first keel, laid down at the Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel, was not a journey of sudden revolution. It was a gradual awakening, a slow accumulation of permissions and capabilities, a patient rebuilding of what many in Germany had never accepted that they had lost. The treaty had said no. The engineers had found ways to work around that no. The politicians had negotiated new terms, and the industrial machine, rusty from disuse but still fundamentally sound, had begun to remember how to build the vessels of war. By the time the first Type XB was being constructed, all of these threads, the old knowledge, the new ambitions, the frustrations of defeat, the hunger for restoration, had woven themselves into something tangible, something made of steel and intention, something that would soon move beneath the waves. The idea of planting mines from beneath the waves, of turning the submarine itself into a silent gardener of steel and explosive devices, did not arrive fully formed in the minds of German naval engineers during the 1930s. Like so many innovations born from the pressures of total war, it had roots that stretched backward, into the First World War, into a time when the very notion of using submarines for anything beyond sinking merchant vessels and warships was still being imagined, tested, and refined through desperate necessity. In those earlier years, when the First World War had transformed naval warfare into something unprecedented and terrible, the German Imperial Navy began to ask itself a question that would echo across the decades. What if a submarine could do more than attack? What if it could lay mines? What if it could, in essence, create invisible fields of destruction that would persist long after the boat itself had departed, harvesting ships not through direct engagement, but through the slow terror of occupation? And so, in the waning years of that first conflict, the UE class was born. These were not large vessels by the standards of what would come, but they were revolutionary in their purpose. Picture them, if you will, as the grandfathers of the Type XB, though their lineage would be refined, enlarged, and reimagined before reaching its apotheosis in the vessels that would haunt the Atlantic during the Second World War. The UE-class submarines, particularly the famous UC series from which they descended, carried mines not in specially designed vertical shafts, but in simple containers fitted along their decks and hulls, a cramped and dangerous arrangement that left little room for error. What remarkable endurance those early mine layers demonstrated. The UE class could cruise for vast distances, far beyond the relative safety of the German coast, reaching into waters where the enemy thought themselves secure. They slipped into distant ports and harbours, laid their silent cargo, and returned home with tales of mines that would claim British and French vessels in the weeks and months that followed. There was an elegance to the strategy, you might say, a patience. The submarine need not wait for the moment of attack. It merely planted the seeds and moved on, letting geography and time do the destructive work. But the designers and commanders of the Imperial German Navy understood something crucial that would be remembered and refined for the decades to come. Minelaying submarines required different qualities than attack boats. They needed greater range, more cargo capacity, the ability to remain away from home for extended periods, while their deadly harvest ripened in distant waters. They needed to be large enough to carry substantial mine loads, yet still swift enough to evade the destroyers and patrol vessels that increasingly hunted them. These were competing demands, always in tension with one another, and the engineering solutions remained imperfect, vulnerable. The lessons of the First World War, though Germany was defeated and humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, did not evaporate. Rather, they sank into the consciousness of the small cadre of naval architects and submarine officers who survived that conflict and carried its knowledge into the interwar years. Among military professionals in Germany, there was a quiet but persistent belief that the next war was not a question of if, but when. And if it came, submarines would play a crucial role, perhaps a decisive one. The British blockade had nearly strangled Germany during the Great War. The next time, one reasoned, might be different if one possessed submarines of greater capability, greater endurance, and greater strategic flexibility. The Type XB, which would eventually emerge as Germany's answer to these questions, owed much to the conceptual foundation laid by those earlier mine layers. Its designers inherited not just the idea, but the accumulated practical knowledge of what worked and what did not. The vertical mine shafts, for instance, that distinctive feature which would make the Type XB so immediately recognizable to historians and submariners alike, represented a solution to problems that the UC and UE classes had struggled with. Rather than cluttering the hull with external mine containers, the new design would integrate the mines into the very structure of the boat, stacked vertically within dedicated chambers. This allowed for a greater mine load while maintaining better hydrodynamic efficiency and reducing the vessel's vulnerability to depth charges that might detonate surface-mounted ordnance. But there was something else too, a philosophical shift that the intervening years had brought about. The early mine layers of the First World War had been primarily that, single-purpose vessels designed first and foremost to lay mines. By the time the Second World War approached, naval planners had begun to contemplate a different possibility. What if a submarine could be more than merely a specialized tool? What if it could serve multiple functions? What if it could lay mines, certainly, but also carry cargo, transport personnel on clandestine missions, supply isolated garrisons, even function as a commerce raider if circumstances demanded? This expansion of purpose, this desire to create a versatile weapon that could adapt to evolving strategic needs, was perhaps the most important legacy that the Type XB inherited from the earlier mine-laying boats. The engineers at Germania Werft, that great shipyard in Kiel where the Type XB would eventually take shape, understood that they were not simply resurrecting an old idea, they were evolving it, improving it, preparing to build a submarine that would embody a decade and a half of accumulated knowledge about what submarines could do and what future naval warfare might demand of them. The transition from the constrained designs of the First World War era to the sophisticated submarines of the 30s and 40s was not merely a matter of building bigger, stronger vessels. It required a fundamental rethinking of purpose, of balance, of how to pack more capability into a single platform while maintaining the essential advantage that all submarines possess, the ability to appear and disappear, to move undetected through hostile waters. The UE class had taught the Germans that mine-laying submarines could be effective. What the intervening years would teach them was how to make such submarines not just effective, but magnificent, capable of achievements that would still astonish naval historians 80 years later. When the naval architects of the Kriegsmarine gathered in the offices overlooking the Kiel shipyards in the mid-1930s, they were thinking about something that had been troubling German naval planners since the end of the First World War: how to wage war against the British not with battleships, which the Treaty of Versailles had forbidden them to build in great numbers, but with submarines that could reach deep into British waters and sever the lifelines of trade and supply that kept the island nation breathing. The mine, you see, had proven itself a weapon of peculiar and haunting power in the Great War. A single mine, drifting in the dark water, cost nothing to maintain, required no crew, and could strike without warning, claiming merchant vessels and warships alike with a kind of mechanical democracy. The British had learned this bitterly, and the German Naval High Command, men who studied history with the careful attention of those planning for a future they feared might come, understood that if war returned, mines would matter again. But there was a problem embedded in this calculation, a problem that shaped everything that followed. The The mines of the era were heavy, cumbersome things. They were large, deeply displaced, and required carefully designed storage and deployment systems. If you wanted to lay significant minefields, the kind that would genuinely threaten British shipping, the kind that would force convoys to reroute and slow, that would wound an empire's circulation, you could not do it with ordinary submarines. Those U-boats were swift and agile, yes, but they were small. They could carry, at most, a dozen or perhaps 24 mines. That was a gesture, not a strategy. That was pinpricks when you needed to draw blood. What if, the planners asked themselves in those quiet offices, you built something larger, something so capacious that it could carry not dozens of mines but hundreds? What if you designed a submarine that was, in essence, a floating mine magazine, so large and so long-range that it could steam across the Atlantic, slip into the waters near Britain or along the approaches to her ports, and discharge its entire deadly cargo in coordinated minefields that would genuinely disrupt the enemy's commerce? It was, when you think about it, a kind of heretical thinking within submarine design philosophy. Since Holland and Lake had first conceived of the submarine at the turn of the century, the logic had been almost religious. Smaller was better. Smaller meant faster, more nimble, harder to detect, easier to hide in the grey-blue depths. Size was the enemy of concealment. Bulk was the friend of your opponent. But the Kriegsmarine asked a different question. What if size became your advantage rather than your liability? What if you built a boat so large, so formidably constructed, and so powerfully engined that it could outrange every other submarine in the world? What if its sheer capability in one specialized role, deep ocean mine laying, became worth more than the conventional advantages of smaller boats? The Type XB represented, in many ways, a gamble on this premise. It was to be, by some measures, the largest submarine that had ever been built for any navy up to that point. Its designers imagined it cutting through the Atlantic swells with the confidence of a capital ship, steam enough in its diesels to cross ocean basins without refueling, armed not with the kind of armament that submarines traditionally carried, though it would have those too, for self-defense, but with the sheer quantity of mines that could reshape naval warfare. Why did they want this? Why was this design worth pursuing when resources were so scarce, when every ton of steel and every skilled worker was precious? The answer lay in a calculation about the future of war at sea. The architects believed that Britain would win if the war became a test of industrial production and sustained supply. Britain was, after all, an island. Everything she needed came across the sea. If the Germans could not win quickly, through some devastating blow or invasion, then they would need to slowly strangle the British economy through attrition. And what better tool for that slow strangulation than vast, impersonal minefields that would persist in the water long after the submarine that laid them had slipped away into the night, killing ships and crew month after month, year after year, without the Kriegsmarine needing to fire a single torpedo. There was something almost dreamlike about this conception, the image of a vast, solitary boat, pregnant with hundreds of mines, venturing alone across the winter Atlantic toward the distant glow of the British Isles. It appealed to the German imagination in a particular way. It was technological, audacious, and deeply romantic in its conception, a single vessel, against the odds, attempting something no one had quite attempted before. And so the orders were drawn up, the specifications were written. The Type XB would displace thousands of tons. It would be longer than a destroyer. Its hull would contain not the usual configuration of torpedo tubes and ballast tanks that characterized other U-boats, but vertical mine shafts, essentially chimneys running the length of the boat, from which mines could be released by means of a simple, mechanical descent system that would gently lower each mine to the seabed below, there to wait and watch in the darkness for the vibration of a ship's propeller passing above. It was engineering that looked, perhaps, toward a different kind of war than the one that would actually come. But in the quiet moments of planning, in the late afternoons when the architects sketched and calculated and dreamed, it seemed like a machine perfectly suited to the dark purpose of strangling an empire. How could such a thing fail? What could possibly prevent such a vessel from doing exactly what it was designed to do? The answer, like so many answers in history, would only become apparent with time. But in the mid-1930s, when the drawings were fresh and the possibilities seemed endless, the Type XB represented something magnificent. The marriage of audacity and engineering, of strategic vision and technological ambition, all condensed into steel and diesel and the deep blue sea. The Type XB Minelayer was by any measure a vessel of extraordinary proportions. At 272 feet in length, it stood as the largest operational U-boat the Kriegsmarine would ever commission during the entire war. To grasp the scale of this, consider that a standard Type Vic, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, stretched a mere 220 feet. The Type XB was not merely longer, it was fundamentally different in its relationship to the ocean, commanding the water around it with a presence that smaller boats simply could not achieve. This length was deliberate, engineered for a purpose that set it apart from its hunting cousins. Beneath the surface, the displacement figures tell us much about the designer's intentions. The boat displaced approximately 1,900 tons when sitting at rest on the surface, but when submerged, fully ballasted and heavy with fuel and cargo, that figure swelled to nearly 2,500 tons. Such weight demanded powerful engines and careful buoyancy management. The engineers at Germaniawerft understood that they were building something that would need to carry far more than torpedoes and men. They were building a vessel capable of venturing into distant waters, of remaining there for months, and of returning home laden with whatever cargo the Reich demanded. What made the Type XB truly distinctive, however, was its internal architecture. Running vertically through the center of the boat, from the forward section to well aft, were mine shafts. These were not conventional holds or storage compartments. They were purpose-built channels, each capable of holding a series of naval mines that would be released through the upper hull without requiring the boat to surface. Imagine, if you will, the internal geometry of the submarine, already an exercise in three-dimensional compression and efficiency, further subdivided by these vertical columns. The shafts themselves numbered 6 in the primary design, arranged in a pattern that allowed for their operation while maintaining the boat's structural integrity and seaworthiness. Each shaft could accommodate mines of varying sizes, though the standard load was the German TM-type mine, a sophisticated weapon that would sink silently to the designated depth and weight, mechanical and patient, for contact with a passing hull. The exact number of mines a Type XB could carry has been the subject of some historical debate among specialists. Most sources suggest a capacity of around 60 mines, though some references indicate higher figures depending on the specific configuration and the mine type in use. What matters more than precise numbers, perhaps, is the operational consequence. Here was a submarine that could, in the course of a single patrol, create an entire minefield where none had existed before. It could, quite literally, reshape the tactical geography of a shipping lane or harbor approach. The mines would be released through apertures in the hull, sinking to their predetermined depths, where they would become invisible threats to any vessel passing overhead. Yet the Type XB was not only a mine layer. It retained the teeth of a conventional submarine in the form of 6 forward-firing torpedo tubes and 2 aft. These were standard 21-inch tubes, familiar to any U-boat commander, capable of launching the acoustic homing torpedoes that emerged later in the war, or the conventional models that had served since the beginning. A submarine optimized purely for mine-laying might have foregone these tubes entirely, trading combat capability for additional cargo space. But the Kriegsmarine wanted flexibility. They wanted their Type XB boats to hunt if the opportunity arose, to defend themselves against escorts, and to have the option of striking at valuable targets that could not be mined but could be sunk. This dual purpose added layers of complexity to the design and the training of its crews. The underwater endurance of the Type XB, when fully provisioned, was genuinely remarkable for its era. The boat's battery capacity and diesel fuel storage were engineered to support patrols extending 17,000 nautical miles or more, which meant the vessel could operate in theaters far from home. Some boats of the class could remain submerged for up to 48 hours without snorkeling, relying on their battery reserves. Above the surface, cruising at moderate speed on diesel power, they could cover enormous distances. This combination of range and endurance transformed them from continental weapons into truly oceanic vessels, capable of reaching the coasts of Africa, the waters of the Indian Ocean, or, in the ambitions of the Japanese-aligned commanders, even the approaches to Japan itself. The pressure hull, the inner skeleton of the boat that actually contained the crew and machinery, was perhaps 12 feet in diameter, a sphere of German steel that had to withstand the enormous crushing forces of the deep. Around this pressure hull, the outer hull extended, creating the distinctive shape that observers saw from the surface. Inside, the crew quarters were even more confined than in smaller boats. Every cubic foot of internal space was precious. The officers occupied tiny cabins that resembled more closely the sleeping berths of naval tradition than any modern bedroom. The enlisted men slept in shifts on narrow bunks, rotating through their sleeping schedules so that every available surface served multiple crew members across different watch rotations. The conning tower, the raised structure through which the captain commanded the boat and from which he navigated using the periscope, was perhaps proportionally larger than on other U-boats, reflecting the size of the vessel and the additional responsibilities of command aboard so sizable a craft. The Type XB required a larger crew than the Type 7, approximately 55 to 60 men, to manage all of its systems, operate its mine-laying equipment, maintain its engines, and keep watch across the decks. More men meant more voices, more personalities, more stories existing in that compressed environment, and more demands on the boat's air purification systems and fresh water supplies. The diesel engines themselves were powerful, German-manufactured machinery, capable of generating considerable horsepower, both for surface cruising and for the electric motors that would drive the boat when submerged. Ventilation systems, refrigeration for food storage, hydraulic systems for controlling the mine shafts, and sophisticated periscope equipment all added to the remarkable complexity of the vessel. The Type XB was, in many ways, not a submarine in the classical sense, but rather a floating workshop, a mobile arsenal, a cargo vessel with weapons, and a miniature naval base, all compressed into a single hull and sent to roam the world's oceans in service of German war aims. When one contemplates these specifications, the length, the displacement, the distinctive vertical shafts, the torpedo armament, and the extraordinary range, one begins to understand why the Type XB occupied such a particular niche in the German submarine fleet. It was expensive to build, requiring rare materials and skilled labor at a time when both were becoming precious beyond measure. It was complex to operate, demanding highly trained crews and sophisticated logistical support. Yet, it offered capabilities that no other submarine in any navy could match quite so completely. The British had mine-laying submarines, but none with such range or cargo capacity. The Americans did not pursue this design path at all, and the Japanese, though they experimented with mine-laying submarines of their own, never achieved quite the same synthesis of size, armament, and endurance that the Kriegsmarine had engineered into these remarkable vessels. The steel began to gather in Kiel in the early months of 1939. If you imagine the sprawling expanse of Germania Werft, that vast shipyard pressed against the Baltic's grey-green waters, you might picture the first sections of what would become U-116 arriving on flatbed cars, cut and shaped in distant foundries, now reassembled here on the slipways where the finest U-boats in the world took form. The shipyard itself was a living organism of industry, a place where the quiet morning air would soon fill with the percussion of riveting hammers, the hiss of acetylene torches, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal that seemed almost musical in its repetition. The workers at Germania Werft were, for the most part, skilled and proud. Many had laboured through the Depression years, their futures uncertain, and now they had steady work in a nation preparing for something vast and unknowable. Some were Nazi Party members, loyal and ideological. Others were simply men doing technical work they understood well, men who had learned their trade from fathers and uncles who had built U-boats in the Great War. They came to the yards before dawn, their breath visible in the cold months, carrying their tools and their lunch pails, their conversations confined to the immediate and the practical. The hull plates arrived in carefully measured sections, enormous curves of steel that seemed impossibly thin until you understood the pressures they would need to withstand at depth, until you grasped that the entire security of a crew's life depended on the integrity of these plates and the precision with which they were joined. The Type XB was unlike anything the Kriegsmarine's shipyards had built before. At 287 feet in length, it dwarfed the standard Type Vik U-boats that had become the workhorse of the fleet. The workers recognized, perhaps without fully understanding it, that they were building something unusual, something with specifications that seemed excessive even by wartime standards. The mine shafts rose vertically through the hull, creating internal architectural challenges that demanded innovation. The storage capacity was vast. The range was extraordinary. There were whispered conversations among the men about what a boat this size might accomplish, though such talk was muted by the ever-present awareness that security was paramount. There were SS men around the docks, watching, listening, noting those who spoke too freely. The launching of a U-boat was invariably a public affair, though controlled carefully. The ceremony for U-116, the first Type XB to slip into the Baltic, took place in the spring of 1940, when Germany seemed assured of victory, when the future still felt open and certain. The slipways were cleared of workers. Naval officers arrived in dress uniforms. The band played the national anthem. Someone important, a local dignitary or a naval official, broke a bottle of champagne across the bow, a gesture that seemed almost incongruous on a vessel designed to move through water like a predator, unseen and lethal. The boat glided into the water, and there was applause. Genuine or performed, it hardly mattered. In the photographs that survive, you can see the imposing bulk of the hull, the tower, rising from the deck, the scale of the vessel apparent only when compared to the tugboats that surrounded it. But the public ceremonies were brief, moments of theatre in a much longer and more laborious process. What followed was months of fitting out, the installation of machinery that had been built elsewhere in the Reich, in workshops scattered across occupied territories. The diesel engines arrived on flatbed trains. The electric motors came separately, installed piece by piece in the narrow hull. The torpedo tubes, 4 forward, 2 aft, were aligned with painstaking precision. The periscopes were fitted, tested, adjusted. Each component represented months of engineering work by specialists who would never see the finished boat, who were part of a vast and invisible machinery of industrial warfare. The workers involved in the fitting out stages knew slightly more of the vessel's intended purpose, and the secrecy deepened as the boat neared completion. Windows in the fitting-out sheds were painted over. Workers were instructed not to discuss their assignments outside the yard. Some aspects of the installation were deliberately kept compartmentalized. The men working on the mine shafts did not speak with the men installing the electrical systems. The knowledge was fragmented, each piece secure in its isolation. This was security through compartmentalization, a principle that the Nazi regime understood intimately. The loading of the mines themselves came last, in the dead of night often, when civilian workers had been sent home and only military personnel remained on the docks. The mines were stored in special magazines beneath the yards, and moving them onto the boats required precision and extreme caution. One accidental detonation at a slipway would have destroyed not only that boat, but potentially much of the yard itself. The men who handled the mines moved slowly, speaking in near whispers, each movement deliberate. There was, perhaps, a certain grim theatricality to it all, the gravity of the work lending itself to silence and careful ceremony. The testing phase came next, and here the boat began to reveal its nature. Test cruises in the protected waters of the Kiel fjord, then further out into the Baltic, then finally the transits to the Atlantic bases where the boats would spend their operational lives. During these trials, the crew members who had been training for months in classrooms and on simulators finally became a functional organism. They learned where to move in the narrow passages, how to maintain balance in a vessel that felt impossibly large until you were inside it and aware of its confines. They practiced diving, learning how the Type XB handled the transition from surface to submerged operation, how to trim the ballast, how to sense the boat's moods through the subtle vibrations in the hull. Between U-116's completion and the commissioning of the remaining boats in the class, the war had shifted subtly. The confidence of 1940 had given way to the uncertainties of 1941 and 1942. The shipyards continued their work, but now there was a different quality to the urgency. U-117, U-178, and U-119 followed U-116 down the slipways in methodical succession, each one emerging from the same process of assembly and fitting out, each one identical in their external dimensions yet unique in the character that came from the particular craftsman who had shaped them. By the time U-233 was under construction, British bombing raids on German shipyards had intensified, and the work had taken on a new precariousness. Workers arrived not knowing if the yard would still be standing at the end of their shift. The discipline and focus required to maintain precision under such circumstances speaks to something almost incomprehensible to our modern experience: the capacity of human beings to do exacting work while living under the threat of destruction. The secrecy that surrounded the Type XB was, in its way, a reflection of its strategic importance. These were not boats meant merely to harass convoy routes or prey on merchant shipping. They were instruments of a larger strategy, one that involved deep ocean mine-laying, the disruption of distant sea lanes, and operations that would require stealth and endurance beyond what conventional submarines could manage. The workers sensed this, in the careful instructions they received, in the specification of components that seemed over-engineered for any obvious purpose, in the way the yards were locked down against espionage and prying eyes. They were building the future, or so they believed, even as that future was already slipping away from the hands of those who had gambled everything on victory through industrial prowess and technological superiority. Down in the belly of the Type XB, where the steel walls curved close enough to brush with an outstretched hand, life unfolded in a rhythm as steady and measured as the submarine's own heartbeat. The boat itself became a living thing to those who crewed her, breathing diesel fumes through her engines, thrumming with the constant vibration of machinery that never truly stopped. even when the men tried to rest in the narrow bunks stacked 3 high in the crew's quarters. The air hung thick and warm below decks, layered with the smells of diesel oil, bilge water, battery acid, and the particular mustiness that accumulated when more than 50 men lived in a space so confined that you couldn't stretch both arms without touching something solid. The hum of those diesel engines became the pulse that sailors measured their days against. When the boat was on the surface, charging its enormous battery banks to feed the electric motors that would run it submerged, the engines throbbed with a rhythm that vibrated through every rivet and seam. Newcomers found the sound overwhelming at first, wondering how anyone could think, let alone sleep, amid such mechanical constancy. But after weeks at sea, the hum became almost soothing, a reminder that the boat was running properly, that the complex dance of machinery was holding together as it should. The engine's tempo changed with the boat's depth and speed, and experienced sailors could read those subtle shifts like a language, knowing instinctively whether the boat was cruising steady or pushing hard through the water. The watch rotations aboard a Type XB Minelayer carved time into carefully measured blocks. 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off. That was the formal rhythm, though the reality proved far more complicated. A sailor might stand his 4 hours in the control room, monitoring gauges and relaying orders, but those 8 hours of time away from watch didn't necessarily mean 8 hours of sleep. There was maintenance to perform, equipment to maintain, the endless small adjustments that kept a submarine functioning. There was also the simple mathematics of desperation. More than 50 men sharing a space designed with perhaps half that comfort in mind. The crew would find themselves rationing sleep the way they rationed food, grabbing it where they could, in shifts, in whatever narrow bunk became available. The men who occupied those bunks developed an almost silent choreography of sharing. A sailor would crawl into a bunk that was still warm from the man who'd just vacated it, the mattress still retaining the shape of his body. Sometimes the transition happened within minutes, the sleeping sailor rolling out just as the next man pulled himself in. In the rare moments when a bunk lay empty and cooling, it was almost a luxury, a few minutes to yourself without someone else's body heat radiating just inches away, without the consciousness that you were occupying a space still fragrant with someone else's exhaustion. There was no self-consciousness about it, no embarrassment. The crew had moved beyond such notions. They were partners in a closed system, dependent on each other for their very lives, and the intimate sharing of sleeping space was simply part of that reality. The control room, where the boat was actually commanded and steered, became the social and operational heart of the Type XB. Here, the commandant, the U-boat captain, stood in his distinctive position near the periscope well, often with his chief engineer close by, reading the boat's vital signs the way a physician reads a patient's pulse. The first watch officer would be coordinating with the men at their stations, the hydrophone operator listening through headsets for the acoustic signatures of enemy ships, the helmsman keeping the boat steady, the plainsman managing the dive and trim. The communication of orders happened in low voices and quick hand gestures, a practiced efficiency that had been drilled into them through countless drills and actual operations. Even in moments of relative calm, there was a formality to the control room, a sense that something vital was always at stake. Away from the control room, in the crew's quarters and the torpedo compartments, a different kind of life existed. Men would gather around the small folding table when they could, playing cards with worn decks that had been handled so many times the faces were barely visible. They would speak in quiet voices. Loudly wasn't really possible anyway, with the ambient noise of the engines, sharing stories from their lives before the war, from their hometowns and their families. Some would pull out letters they'd received before leaving port, reading them again and again as if the words might change with each viewing, as if some new meaning might emerge from the familiar phrases of wife, or mother, or girlfriend. There was comfort in these rituals, in the repetition, in the solidarity of men who understood without needing to say that they were all frightened, all uncomfortable, all somehow bound together in this strange and dangerous existence. The galley, the boat's small kitchen, occupied a space barely larger than a closet, yet it held a significance to the crew that far exceeded its physical dimensions. The cook, a role of surprising importance aboard any submarine, would work miracles with the limited provisions, making real coffee when supplies allowed, baking bread in a tiny oven, creating meals that were somehow more than their constituent parts. When the crew assembled for meals, which happened in shifts since there wasn't space for everyone to eat together, there was an almost ceremonial quality to it. The cook's standing was uniquely high on a submarine. A good cook could maintain morale far better than speeches about duty and the fatherland. A man with a full stomach and hot coffee in his hands could tolerate discomfort and fear more easily than one who was hungry and cold. The officers' quarters, small as they were, offered a tiny refuge of slightly more privacy. The commandant would have his own small cabin, barely large enough for a narrow bunk and a desk, yet it was his domain where he could think, plan, and occasionally allow himself to show the strain that such responsibility demanded. The other officers would share a small wardroom, a space slightly less cramped than the crew's quarters, where they could review charts, discuss operational matters, and have brief moments of respite. But even here, there was little privacy. The walls were thin, the space shared. An officer might retire to his bunk, only to hear the intimate sounds of the man in the next compartment, the scrape of boots being removed, the sigh of someone settling into sleep. The rhythm of the boat's daily existence was further punctuated by the sounds that sailors learned to interpret with almost unconscious precision. The particular quality of the diesel engines changed as the boat's speed varied. A quick, sharp acceleration that everyone felt in their chests meant urgent action was likely. The metallic groan of the pressure hull under deep water carried a subtle timbre that experienced sailors could distinguish from normal operational sounds. The phone system that connected various compartments of the boat created its own acoustic environment. The crackle of transmission, the sharp bark of orders, the occasional moment of static that felt almost like holding one's breath. For younger sailors especially, the initial experience of being underwater in the boat was profoundly disorienting. The light, provided by a system of dim electric bulbs, seemed to flatten everything, to drain color and depth. Time itself felt strange, without the natural rhythm of day and night. Without sunlight marking the passage of hours, the internal clock became unreliable. A man might wake from sleep and have no clear sense of whether he'd been asleep for 2 hours or 6. The watch system tried to impose order on this, but the body often resisted. Some men adjusted quickly to the perpetual twilight of the boat's interior. Others never quite adapted, carrying a subtle unease that never fully disappeared. The camaraderie that developed among the crew, particularly on the longer voyages when the boat might be at sea for weeks at a stretch, took on a distinctive character. There was no room for rank consciousness in the traditional sense. The physical reality of the confined space made hierarchy practical rather than ceremonial. You obeyed your officers not because of abstract notions of military structure, but because they were responsible for keeping everyone alive, and their orders were means toward that survival. At the same time, there was a respect that went deeper than mere military discipline. A good commandant earned loyalty not through barking orders, but through the decisions he made under pressure, through his willingness to take risks that might save the crew and caution that might protect them. The men knew, with the clarity that comes from proximity and danger, whether their captain was someone who could be trusted with their lives. Quiet moments emerged during the long hours between significant events. A sailor might sit alone in a corner of the crew's quarters, writing in a small journal, nothing too detailed, nothing that could be compromised if captured, trying to hold on to a sense of individual identity in a space that demanded so much collective conformity. The page, the pencil, the few minutes alone with one's thoughts became precious in ways that land-bound people might struggle to understand. Another man might spend his free hours maintaining his equipment with meticulous care, cleaning his station far more thoroughly than regulations required, finding a kind of meditation in the repetitive motions. The boat demanded constant attention to detail. An overlooked problem in a valve or a gauge could eventually prove fatal. So vigilance became not just a duty but a kind of prayer, a way of controlling chaos through the careful management of small, concrete things. As time underwater accumulated, a peculiar domesticity emerged. Men knew each other's habits with intimate precision. They could tell from a shift in someone's breathing whether he was truly asleep or just lying in his bunk, trying to escape into unconsciousness. They knew who was feeling seasick from the boat's motion, who was struggling with claustrophobia, who was thinking about his family back in Germany. There were unspoken agreements about personal space, about when to reach out with a word or gesture of support, and when to leave someone alone with his thoughts. A sailor would learn the precise temperature at which the control room felt most comfortable, the particular smell of the air after it had been recycled through the CO2 scrubbers, the way the boat moved through different densities of water. The small rituals of self-care continued, even under these constrained circumstances. Men would shave using communal razor blades and a minimal amount of fresh water. Salt water, or water from one of the boat's recycling systems, was sometimes used as a substitute. They would attempt to maintain some standard of personal hygiene despite the limitations. The bathroom, a tiny head tucked away in one corner of the boat, was used in careful shifts. There was an etiquette to it, a kind of mutual understanding that everyone would maintain some pretense of privacy, even though the sound carried through the boat, and everyone knew when the head was in use. These small gestures toward maintaining one's dignity and cleanliness were not merely practical, but deeply psychological. To continue grooming, to wash one's face. The first of these remarkable vessels to slide into the water came in the spring of 1941 at the Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel, where the noise of construction gave way to the ceremonial quiet of a launch. U-116 was her name, a boat that would carry the experimental burden of being first, and with it, the unknowns that always attend new designs in wartime. The workers who had assembled her piece by careful piece, the welders with their torches, the engineers who fitted each compartment with meticulous care, watched as she entered the water for the first time, and somewhere in that moment, there was perhaps a collective exhale, a recognition that months of theoretical drawings had become a living thing of steel and purpose. U-116 would be followed in close succession by her sisters, U-117, U-118, and U-119, each one departing the slipway over the course of that year and into 1942. They arrived into a world already transformed by 2 years of war, a world where the U-boat arm, once the shadowy enterprise of secret rearmament, had become the cutting edge of German naval strategy. These 4 boats represented something the Kriegsmarine had never possessed before in such a concentrated form: the capacity to project mining operations across vast distances of open ocean, to plant invisible fields that would disrupt enemy commerce routes with the patience of a spider in its web. The initial trials were necessarily brief, born of both wartime urgency and the inherent caution that accompanies new vessels with untested systems. U-116 descended into the North Sea's grey waters, her captain and crew learning the rhythm of a boat that was substantially larger than anything they had likely commanded before. The Type XB's distinctive vertical mine shafts, Those elegant columns that rose through her hull like an architect's daring choice had to be tested in actual diving conditions. Would they flood correctly when the time came to flood them for mine ejection? Would the mechanisms that controlled the release of those deadly cargo items function with precision, or would they bind and stick in ways no desk-bound designer could have predicted? These were not questions that could be answered from shore. They required the boat to go down, deeper than most submarines of the day regularly ventured, and to experience the pressure that the sea applies to steel with indifferent force. The crews aboard these early commissions developed a keen sense of their vessel's personality, for submarines are like that. Each one, despite coming from the same blueprints, develops its own character. U-117 might handle dive angles differently than her sister U-116. U-118 might have a particular resonance in her engine room that was unique to her construction, her welds, the exact composition of her metal. These were details that mattered profoundly to men whose lives depended on understanding every idiosyncrasy of their floating steel tomb. By the autumn of 1941, U-116 had completed enough trials that the Kriegsmarine felt confident assigning her to her first operational patrol. There is something poignant in considering that moment, the boat leaving Kiel or one of the other German ports in Norway, heading out into the Atlantic with a crew who understood in theory what they would be doing, but had never actually laid a field of mines in combat conditions. The commanding officer would have reviewed the charts showing where the mine-laying mission was to take place, probably somewhere off the coast of Britain or in the approaches to Gibraltar, waters that were known to be patrolled by British destroyers and aircraft. The tension of such an assignment would be peculiar, not the immediate danger of combat, but something perhaps more insidious, the long, grinding awareness that discovery at any moment during the mine-laying process could be catastrophic, since the boat would necessarily move slowly while deploying her cargo, would be constrained in her ability to maneuver, would be more vulnerable than a standard submarine designed solely for stealth and speed. The mine shafts would be loaded with their deadly cargo in the relative safety of port, either mines of the German Navy's own design, or captured British mines that had been carefully rendered safe and then re-equipped with German fuses. Loading was a process requiring exquisite attention, since a single error could transform the boat into a floating bomb before it ever reached its patrol area. Once loaded, the weight of those mines sat in her belly, inert but always present in the minds of the crew. During any patrol, the submarine would carry perhaps 70 mines or more, each one a ton or more of purpose-built destruction, stacked in her vertical shafts, held in place by mechanisms that seemed impossibly delicate for something so lethal. U-117 followed a similar path into operational service, her commander also tasked with carrying this new class of weapon across the Atlantic. The early operations by these boats were not without their complications and discoveries. It became clear quite quickly that the theoretical range calculated for the Type XB submarines needed adjustment when actual fuel consumption was measured against the arithmetic of war. A patrol that was supposed to take a boat to a distant location and back again, with time for mine-laying operations, could be subject to unexpected delays, a mechanical issue requiring cautious repair while submerged, a need to avoid detection that meant taking longer routes, or simply the sea itself refusing to cooperate with the navigator's elegant calculations. U-118 and U-119 entered service with the accumulated knowledge of their older sisters' early patrols, which meant their commanding officers had received briefings and reports from the crews who had come before them. This sharing of experience, informal and formal, represented the kind of institutional learning that separates a war machine that stumbles along from one that begins to develop genuine expertise. The captains would have understood by then the particular vulnerabilities of these large boats. They were magnificent for range and carrying capacity, but their size made them less nimble in the confined waters where Allied patrol craft might force them to the surface and make a desperate escape run on diesel engines. The early assignments for these first 4 commissioned boats included not only mine-laying, but also reconnaissance missions and occasionally supply-carrying duties to German bases that were becoming increasingly isolated. A Type XB Minelayer, because of her size and her range, could be repurposed for missions that standard submarines could not easily undertake. This adaptability would become increasingly important as the war progressed, and the Kriegsmarine found itself required to stretch its resources across an ever-expanding spectrum of needs. And nowhere else could this flexibility prove more valuable than in the vast, often neglected theaters of the Indian Ocean and South Atlantic, where a boat with the range of a Type XB could range far beyond the reach of other submarines and potentially disrupt enemy operations in places where the Allies had begun to assume relative safety. The first dawn when U-116 slipped from her pen at keel and pointed toward the open North Sea marked the beginning of something the Kriegsmarine had been planning in careful detail for nearly 2 years. The boat was riding lower in the water than usual, weighted down by her cargo, not the sleek geometry of torpedoes, but something far more insidious. The mine shafts running vertically through her hull held 56 mines each, stored in neat rows like the keys of a vast mechanical organ, waiting to be played out one by one across the shipping lanes of the Atlantic. The crew had trained for this through the long months of trials, the repetitive cycles of loading and unloading, the careful calibration of ballast and trim. Now, as the bow cut through the grey water and the coast fell away, they were undertaking something that no submarine quite like theirs had done before. What made these early missions so profoundly tense was not the sailing itself. German U-boats had been crossing to the Atlantic for months, but the extraordinary vulnerability that came with the act of laying mines. To seed a minefield, a submarine must reduce speed. It cannot maneuver with its usual agility. It must travel to a precise location, slow to perhaps 3 or 4 knots, and methodically release its mines one after another, each one dropping away into the darkness below. For perhaps 6 or 7 hours, sometimes longer, the boat became almost stationary. The mines themselves were released through special chutes, designed so that each one would descend on a predetermined depth charge fuse, ready to be triggered by the vibration of a ship's hull passing overhead. But during those long, measured hours of laying, the U-boat was deaf to much of what happened around it. The regular pinging of sonar was muffled by her own operations. The crew could hear little beyond the soft hydraulic hiss of each mine releasing, the gentle displacement of water as steel cylinders fell away into the depths. The commanding officers of these boats, men like Kapitän Leutnant Würdemann on U-116, who would earn a reputation for meticulous professionalism, understood this perfectly. They studied the patterns of British and American shipping with the intensity of chess players analyzing openings. They knew that the waters off Gibraltar, the approaches to Freetown, the shipping lanes that converged near the southern tip of Ireland, all of these were arteries through which the lifeblood of British commerce flowed. A well-placed minefield, they reasoned, could close those arteries with invisible precision. But knowing where to lay mines and actually laying them while staying alive were 2 entirely different problems. The tension aboard during these operations came in layers, accumulating like the pressure of the ocean itself. The first layer was simply the awareness that any British or American convoy, any patrol vessel, any wandering anti-submarine trawler could emerge from the murk at any moment. The U-boat crews maintained strict radio silence during these missions, which meant they were blind to any warnings from other German boats in the area. They had only their own ears and their own hydrophones, listening intently to the water around them. Every sound became a potential harbinger, the distant throb of a destroyer's engines. Would it approach or fade away? the splash of a whale surfacing. The heart would quicken for just a moment before reason reasserted itself. The soft patter of rain on the sea surface above, which they could somehow feel in their bones, though the sound was far too faint to reach their ears beneath the waves. The mine-laying process itself introduced a different sort of tension, one that was more procedural and yet somehow more unnerving. Once the boat was positioned correctly, the captain would give the order to begin laying. The engineer, usually a petty officer of considerable experience, would stand at the mine release mechanism, methodically triggering each one, pull the handle, wait for the soft thud and hydraulic sigh that meant a mine had departed. Check the gauge, showing how many remained in the shafts. Repeat, repeat, repeat. The process had to be flawless. A stuck mine, a misfire, a mechanical jam, any of these could compromise the mission, or worse, could cause a catastrophic failure that might flood the mine shafts and send the boat and all 200 men aboard to the bottom in minutes. The crews had drilled for this. They had practiced in training flotillas under the watchful eyes of experienced petty officers, and yet, in the actual moment, the knowledge that one's life depended on a system of pulleys and valves and perfectly calibrated hydraulic pressure created a peculiar species of tension that never fully disappeared, no matter how many mines one had successfully laid. The records that survived the war diaries and the occasional interview given by survivors, suggest that the boats often laid their mines in areas shrouded by darkness and weather. U-116's first operational mine-laying mission took her into waters off the British coast, where the murk was absolute, where the visibility from the periscope was measured in yards at best. The crew would move quietly through the boat, speaking in low voices or not speaking at all. The watch officers would maintain their vigil in the control room, fingers poised over the trim controls, ready to adjust the boat's depth or angle in an instant if necessary. The hydrophone operators, sitting in their quiet space with headphones clamped over their ears, would listen to the underwater world with the concentration of musicians tuning an orchestra. What was that sound? Was it a whale or a ship's propeller? How far away was it? Was it growing louder or fading? The mine-laying process, once complete, still left the boat far from safe. She had to withdraw from the area, slowly and carefully, without disturbing the newly laid field or attracting attention to it. The captain would order a slow, quiet departure, hoping to slip away from the area while the enemy remained unaware that anything had changed. Sometimes, if intelligence suggested that a convoy would soon pass through the area, the boat would linger at a distance, listening for the distant rumble of approaching engines, waiting to hear whether the mines had done their work. This waiting was perhaps the most difficult part of all. The crew members would calculate the odds, would speculate quietly about what might happen, would wonder whether the months of training, the risk, the tension, whether any of it would matter at all. What is perhaps remarkable when one considers these early mine-laying missions is that they actually did matter, at least for a time. The mines laid by U-116 and her sister boats U-117, U-118, and U-19 during the early phases of their operational service did sink ships. They did create navigational hazards that forced convoys to take longer routes. They did cost the Allies merchant vessels and, more significantly, they did force the enemy to expend considerable effort to locate and sweep the minefields. It was a form of success, though one measured in silent, invisible victories, rather than in the dramatic explosions and sinking vessels that other U-boats were experiencing in surface gun battles or in their torpedo attacks. There was something almost lonely about this form of warfare. To lay a minefield and then have to abandon it, to never know with certainty whether the mines would find their targets, to return to port and wonder whether the months of tension and careful work had been worthwhile. The early Atlantic mine-laying operations, conducted between 1941 and 1942, established a pattern that would persist throughout the war. The boats would sortie from their pens, transit quietly across the Bay of Biscay, always a dangerous passage, as the waters were increasingly patrolled by British aircraft, and then make their way to assigned areas in the Atlantic. There, in waters cold and grey, and sometimes viciously stormy, they would reduce speed and begin their delicate work. The mines would fall away one by one, descending through the water column to settle on the seabed or hang at their designated depths like patient predators. And the crew, in their metal cylinder far below the surface, would continue their vigil, listening and waiting, tense and focused, knowing that for the next several hours they were more vulnerable than they would ever be, and hoping that no enemy would notice, hoping that the next sound they heard would not be the first detonation of a depth charge. Yet, as the years of war deepened, and the strategic landscape of the Atlantic shifted beneath the surface of tactical necessity, the later boats of the Type XB class found themselves assigned to purposes that their original designers had scarcely imagined. The boats that came into service in the middle years of the war, U-219, U-220, U-233, and the extraordinary U-234, inherited a different world than their predecessors had known. The early minelayers had operated in an ocean where German submarines still held a kind of shadow dominion, where the act of laying a field could still shake Allied shipping operations. But by the time U-219 and U-220 were commissioned, that calculus had changed entirely. The waters of the Atlantic no longer belonged to Germany in any meaningful sense. Convoys traveled with heavier escort, with newer detection equipment, with aircraft overhead. The mine-laying role, though never entirely abandoned, had begun to seem almost secondary to the vast potential of these enormous vessels. A Type XB boat represented an enormous investment of steel, labor, and precious submarine building capacity. To send such a craft on a simple mine-laying mission, to lay its carefully counted mines and slip home, seemed, to some minds in the Kriegsmarine Command, a waste of something far more valuable. What if these boats could carry something else? What if they could do something more? The submarine, you see, has always been an instrument of secrecy, a floating vault beneath the waves. The larger boats, the supply submarines and the long-range cruisers of the German fleet had already proven that they could carry far more than weapons. They could carry fuel for other submarines. They could carry supplies and ammunition and spare parts. They could carry mail from home. But what of carrying something of truly strategic importance? What of carrying something that could not be trusted to surface ships? What of carrying something so secret that its journey itself had to be hidden from the world? As the war pressed on, and Germany's situation began that slow, almost imperceptible darkening that would eventually become desperate, the later Type XB boats were increasingly tasked with these clandestine missions. U-219, which would have once been assigned to lay mines off the Irish coast or in the approaches to Gibraltar, found itself instead engaged in longer, stranger voyages. Supply runs to the Far East, where German naval interests clung to scattered islands and isolated ports. Courier missions carrying documents and intelligence that could not be risked on ordinary mail routes. The mines were still aboard, but they sat unused in their shafts, like tools left in a workshop, as the nature of the work itself was redefined. U-2020 followed a similar trajectory, though the details of its service remain less completely documented, scattered across archives in different countries, preserved in the recollections of men who grew old and eventually passed from memory. What is known is that by 1944, these boats had become something closer to transports than true combat vessels, though they remained dangerous in every sense. They were still hunted, they were still potentially lethal, but their missions had taken on a character of hushed importance, the kind of work that happened in the spaces between official records. Then there was U-233, Here the transformation is perhaps most clearly visible. U-233 was commissioned relatively late in the Type XB's production run, and it served in the Atlantic, and it did lay mines in the traditional fashion. But it is remembered now chiefly for something else, for the human cost of its operation, for a loss that would echo among the small community of German submariners in a way that mere tonnage sunk could never do. The details lie ahead in the tide of this narrative, but it is worth noting that by the time U-233 was operating, the role of the Minelayer had become almost a cover story, a description of a boat that was asked to do far more than lay mines. And then there was U-234, a boat that would eventually become the most famous, or perhaps infamous, of all the Type XB Minelayers. U-234 was commissioned late in the war, when victory was already becoming an increasingly distant prospect for Germany. It was launched, in fact, into a world where the outcome was no longer truly in doubt, where every new submarine entering service did so knowing that the waters it would traverse were increasingly hostile, increasingly surveilled, increasingly expensive in human life to traverse at all. U-234 would be asked to undertake a voyage that encapsulated everything the Type XB had become by 1945. Not a weapons platform primarily, not a minelayer in any traditional sense, but a messenger, a carrier of secrets, a submarine bearing not mines but something far stranger and far more troubling to contemplate. The shifting of these boats' roles tells us something profound about how wars evolve, how military organizations adapt when circumstances demand it. The Kriegsmarine had foreseen a particular need, the need for submarines that could lay mines at extreme distance. It had designed a ship to meet that need, but as the conflict deepened, as the strategic situation transformed, as Germany's position shifted from aggressive expansion to desperate defense, the very tools that had been designed for one purpose were repurposed for another. The hull remained the same. The submarine, beneath the water, pursued its silent work. But what that work meant, what it carried, why it mattered, all of this transformed across the years of the war. Consider the crew of U-219 setting out on a voyage to the Indian Ocean, or to one of Germany's scattered island possessions, knowing that such a journey would take months, that their chances of encountering enemy forces were substantial, that if they were found, their size, that great advantage in terms of range and cargo capacity, would become a liability, making them easier to detect, harder to hide, more likely to be sunk. The Minelayer had become something else. It had become a hope, a gamble, a risk undertaken in the hopes of some strategic prize that might justify the expense, the danger, the cost in lives. It is a peculiar thing to consider as you settle deeper into these details, deeper into the slow unfolding story of these boats and the men who crewed them. What begins as a specific military design, a ship built for a singular, defined purpose, becomes through the pressure of circumstances something far more flexible, far more ambiguous. The Type XB had been born from a very particular need. By the time U-219 and U-220 and U-233 and U-234 were at sea, those boats had become something that transcended their original purpose. They had become the Kriegsmarine's attempt to do the impossible, to maintain a strategic initiative when the initiative had already, in truth, slipped away into history. As the war deepened and Germany's position across Europe became ever more precarious, the strategic calculus that had birthed the Type XB began to shift in subtle but profound ways. The mine-laying mission, which had seemed so vital in those early years of the conflict, gradually revealed itself to be only one thread in a far larger tapestry of naval necessity. The boats that had been conceived and built with such singular purpose found themselves called upon for tasks their designers had perhaps anticipated but never fully embraced. This transformation was not sudden or dramatic, but rather a quiet evolution born from desperation, opportunity, and the simple reality that a submarine so large and so capable could not be permitted to serve only one function when the Reich needed them for so many. By 1942 and into the following years, the Type XB Minelayers began to assume the role of supply vessels, their vast internal spaces repurposed from ordnance to provisions and materiel. This was perhaps inevitable. Germany's scattered overseas possessions, her isolated garrisons, her far-flung agents and distant allies, all of them cried out for resupply across seas increasingly patrolled by enemy warships and aircraft. The Type XB, with its extraordinary range and its deep diving capability, could accomplish in relative safety what surface vessels could no longer attempt. Imagine, if you will, the reconfiguration of these boats in the dockyards, the careful removal of mine shafts, the installation of specially designed containers that could be sealed against the salt water's corrosive touch. What had been instruments of strategic interdiction became, instead, fragile lifelines stretched across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. These supply missions carried their own particular burden and dignity. The crews understood that they were no longer hunting, no longer placing ordnance in the paths of enemy convoys. They were instead engaged in a far more humble but equally vital enterprise, keeping distant outposts alive, maintaining communication with allies, preserving Germany's reach at a time when that reach was being systematically dismantled. The boats would depart from their home ports laden with ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts for submarines and surface vessels, even packages of propaganda material destined for German agents operating in neutral countries. Each voyage was calculated in meticulous detail, the supply quantities balanced against fuel consumption, the route planned to avoid the most heavily trafficked patrol lanes. But supply runs were merely the beginning of this transformation. As the Atlantic grew ever more dangerous for conventional submarines, and as Germany's strategic position shifted from conquest to preservation, certain Type XB boats were selected for missions of an altogether different character. These were the clandestine transport assignments, the secret sorties that would carry not merely supplies, but information, diplomatic envoys, scientists, and in some cases, cargo whose very nature was shrouded in such secrecy that even the crew did not fully understand what they protected. Consider for a moment the weight of such knowledge, or perhaps more accurately, the weight of deliberately withheld knowledge. The men aboard knew only that their boat was special, that their orders were sealed and would be opened only at sea, that their mission transcended the ordinary calculations of submarine warfare. There was a particular class of these clandestine missions that involved what historians sometimes refer to as the blockade run in reverse. While German commerce raiders and blockade runners had previously attempted to break through to Germany from distant ports, now the pattern inverted. Submarines, with their ability to travel submerged and unseen, became the preferred method for maintaining contact with distant outposts and allies. The Type XB boats, among the largest and most capable, were ideal for such work. They could carry passengers, distinguished scientists, military attachés, diplomats, in the relative comfort afforded by their spacious interior. They could transport materials that were too valuable or too secret to risk aboard ordinary cargo vessels. They could, in essence, become floating embassies beneath the waves. One might wonder whether the men who crewed these vessels understood the historical significance of what they were doing, or whether they simply executed their orders with the quiet professionalism that had become their hallmark. The answer, almost certainly, lies somewhere between these two poles. They knew that their missions were important, that they were trusted with secrets, that the boat beneath them was something extraordinary, but the full scope of what they carried, where it was going, and why it mattered in the grand scheme of the war, these remained mysteries, even in memory. The logistical challenges of such missions were staggering. A Type XB boat outfitted for supply or transport duties had to carry fuel sufficient for months-long voyages to distant oceans. It had to maintain habitability for crew members who might now number closer to 70 than the original complement. The extra personnel consisting of specialists, passengers, technicians needed for whatever mission awaited at journey's end. The air grew thick in these boats during extended underwater periods, the smell of diesel and human waste mingling with sweat, and the particular metallic scent of a steel hull under extreme pressure. The galley worked continuously to produce food that was simultaneously nourishing and psychologically comforting, because morale on such extended voyages was always a delicate matter. These evolved roles also meant that combat, when it occurred, took on a different character. A Type XB, engaged in supply operations, could not afford to fight its way through an enemy convoy. Its captain understood that discretion was not merely preferred, but essential. The boat was more valuable intact, successfully delivering its cargo, than in any glorious but ultimately fatal engagement. This required a different temperament, perhaps, than that of the conventional U-boat commander, whose training and instinct called for aggressive action and tactical victory. The men who commanded these supply submarines were instead navigators of probability and caution, men who calculated distance from danger zones with the same care that others calculated firing solutions. As the technological war shifted and evolved, as radar became more sophisticated and Allied anti-submarine tactics more deadly, these large boats became increasingly vulnerable in their new roles. Their size, which had always been something of a liability in submarine warfare despite their advantages, became more pronounced when they were attempting to move undetected through heavily patrolled waters rather than engaging in the rapid, aggressive strikes for which submarines were originally designed. A minelayer's deliberate descent to lay its ordnance could be timed and planned. A supply boat attempting to slip through enemy patrol lines could not afford such luxury. The men aboard these vessels understood, in the way that combat personnel always understand, that each voyage might be their last, that the boat beneath them, for all its sophistication and size, remained fundamentally vulnerable to the many weapons arrayed against it. Among all the Type XB boats that slipped through the Atlantic's dark waters, one voyage would come to carry a weight unlike any mine-laying mission that had come before it. U-234 was ordered in early 1943, launched in the spring of 1944, and commissioned into the Kriegsmarine that August, taking her place among the last of the great minelayers. But as 1945 arrived and the war tightened around Germany like an ever-narrowing grip, U-234's purpose would transform entirely. She would become, in her final voyage, a vessel of secrets and desperate hope, carrying not mines, but something the High Command believed might yet alter the course of the conflict itself. In March of that year, as the Soviet army advanced from the east and Allied forces pressed from the west, U-234 received orders that would set her apart from every other boat in the U-boat fleet. She was to embark on a mission to Japan, not a combat patrol, not a mine-laying operation in distant waters, but a long-range transport voyage, carrying materials and technical expertise that the German military had come to see as precious beyond measure. The journey itself was extraordinary, a voyage of over 14,000 nautical miles that would require her to thread past Allied patrols across the entire expanse of the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and deep into the Indian Ocean. How had the German and Japanese governments, despite their alliance, maintained such little information about each other's technological advances that this journey still seemed worthwhile? The question itself speaks to the isolation and secrecy that had come to define both militaries' operations by war's end. The cargo that U-234 carried below decks was meticulously catalogued and guarded with extraordinary care. German military blueprints, technical drawings, and specifications for weapons systems that Berlin believed Tokyo urgently required. There were components and parts for advanced aeronautical designs, including materials related to jet propulsion technology that Germany had pioneered. There were also samples of a powder, a metallic compound that would later raise far more questions than anyone aboard could have anticipated. What precisely was the nature of this material? The historical record remains, even now, somewhat veiled. Some scholars suggest it was related to advanced metallurgical research. Others have speculated about its use in experimental weapons development. The uncertainty itself, the quiet mystery at the heart of the voyage, seems to have shadowed the boat's entire passage across the world's oceans. U-234's commander for this mission was Kapitänleutnant Johann Fehler, a seasoned officer who understood the gravity of what had been entrusted to his boat and crew. He was a man of careful demeanor, methodical in his approach, keenly aware that this voyage carried political and strategic dimensions that extended far beyond the operational concerns of a typical U-boat patrol. His orders were explicit: reach Japan, deliver the cargo intact, and under no circumstances allow the vessel or its contents to fall into Allied hands. The weight of that directive would have settled upon every man aboard as they prepared for departure. U-234 left Kiel on March 16, 1945, her hull riding low in the water under the burden of her cargo and supplies for an ocean crossing that might take 3 months or more. The boat slipped away from the German coast in darkness, as so many U-boats had done before her, but this passage would be unlike any that had preceded it. She carried not the mineral wealth of Swedish iron ore, not military supplies for distant ports, but something that represented Germany's own technological desperation, and her final reaching toward an ally who was growing ever more distant in both geography and strategic alignment. The Atlantic crossing itself was a study in the diminished circumstances of the U-boat war by 1945, where once U-boats had prowled these waters with relative confidence, operating in wolf packs and overwhelming Allied convoys through sheer force of numbers, now a single boat traveling alone faced dangers on all sides. Allied radar had transformed naval warfare. Escort ships were everywhere. Aircraft ranged far from coastal bases, hunting submarines with sonar and depth charges. The very size that had once given the Type XB boats their extended range and carrying capacity now became a vulnerability. U-234 was nearly 300 feet long, a vast vessel by submarine standards, easier to detect, easier to track, more cumbersome to maneuver when danger appeared. And yet she had to proceed. She had to cross an ocean that had become increasingly hostile to the men beneath it. What must it have been like for those sailors as they passed south along the Spanish coast, descended into the warmer waters off Portugal and Morocco, and began their long journey down the western coast of Africa? They would have known, with a clarity that perhaps only submariners could possess, that they were among the last crew members of the last submarines that Germany would ever send on such voyages. The war was visibly ending. Radio messages from home grew shorter, less frequent, increasingly difficult to receive and interpret. The infrastructure they had known, the ports, the supply lines, the entire apparatus that had sustained the U-boat fleet for nearly 6 years, was dissolving. And yet they continued toward the east, toward a destination that grew more distant with each passing day, carrying their precious cargo through waters they had to hope would remain unpatrolled. By May, as U-234 rounded the Cape of Good Hope and turned her bow northeastward toward the Indian Ocean, Germany itself was collapsing. Hitler had taken his own life. The Wehrmacht in Europe was surrendering regiment by regiment. Berlin had fallen. The entire strategic foundation upon which the mission had been authorized had crumbled into rubble and ash. But news traveled slowly to a submerged boat crossing the Indian Ocean. Capitaine Feyler would have faced an agonizing uncertainty. Should he continue toward Japan? Should he turn back toward Germany, assuming any German port still stood? Should he attempt to reach a neutral port and seek refuge? What use was a cargo of scientific materials and technical specifications when the nation that had created them no longer existed as an independent power? In mid-May, receiving radio signals that confirmed the absolute defeat of Germany, U-234's captain made a decision that would preserve both his boat and her crew, even as it meant surrendering the mission that had consumed months of planning and ocean crossing. He altered course for the nearest Allied port. On May 14, 1945, U-234 surfaced in the mid-Atlantic and signaled her surrender to the USS Sutton, an American escort vessel. The boat that had carried Germany's technological secrets across half the world was now in the hands of those she had been fleeing. What happened next was equally extraordinary. As American naval officers and scientific personnel examined U-234 and catalogued her cargo, they began to comprehend that this single submarine's hold contained a window into German technological development that conventional intelligence services might have taken months or years to piece together. The blueprints, the specifications, the samples, all of it represented a direct transfer of knowledge from a defeated enemy to the victorious Allies, provided not through espionage or slow reconstruction, but handed over wholesale by a captain who had determined that the cause it served no longer existed. Some of what U-234 carried would eventually find its way into post-war Allied research and development programs. Some of it would inform American scientific understanding of where German innovation had advanced to in those final years of conflict. And some of it, particularly those mysterious samples of metallic compound, would raise questions that historians and researchers continue to examine and debate, even now, more than 3/4 of a century later. The voyage of U-234, incomplete though it was, stands as a peculiar coda to the entire history of the Type XB Minelayers. It represents, in a way, the final statement of a submarine class designed to project German power across the world's oceans, now reduced to delivering technological residue to a war already lost. There is something profoundly melancholic in that transformation, from a boat conceived as a weapon of commerce destruction and strategic naval warfare, to a messenger carrying fragments of ambition to an alliance that could no longer be sustained. And yet, in that surrender and that delivery of cargo, U-234 would in fact contribute, however indirectly, to shaping the post-war world in ways that neither her designers nor her crew could have imagined. Yet the vast Atlantic would not remain a refuge for long. By the middle months of 1942, as the Type XB boats began their regular patrols beyond the continental shelf, the waters themselves seemed to grow darker, more watchful. The boats that had slipped through the North Sea in their infancy now faced an enemy that was learning to see in ways the designers had never anticipated: radar. A technology that transformed the invisible pursuit into something altogether more desperate, more immediate, more fatal. The first encounters were rare enough to be almost abstract. A lookout on watch, scanning the grey horizon at dawn or dusk, might report the sudden presence of a ship where radar had painted it on an invisible canvas miles away. The Allied escort vessels, corvettes, frigates, destroyers, were themselves being fitted with detection equipment that could sense the presence of a U-boat on the surface, even in darkness or fog. This changed everything. The Type XB, for all its sophistication and range, was at its most vulnerable when running on the surface, charging its batteries, drawing breath. And now that very act of breathing had become dangerous. Consider what this meant for the crews. They had trained for the traditional hunt, the cat and mouse of visual spotting and evasion. But how do you evade something you cannot see? How do you flee from an enemy whose eyes are not in the sky, but woven into invisible waves traveling at the speed of light? The tension aboard during these months took on a different quality. It was less the sharp alertness of a known threat, and more the creeping anxiety of vulnerability from an unseen direction. Sonar technology added another layer to this unease. The Allied destroyers, frigates, and specialized anti-submarine vessels were learning to listen to the water itself, to hear the mechanical signatures of a diesel engine, the particular rhythm of propellers cutting through the deep. The Type XB boats, for all their advantages in size and cargo capacity, were not inherently stealthy vessels. They were large, designed for specific missions rather than for ghosting silently through contested waters. Their mine-laying apparatus, the vertical shafts running through their hulls, made them even bulkier, their acoustic profile unmistakable once a trained sonar operator knew what to listen for. The U-boat arm had never truly been designed for a war of attrition in the face of coordinated, technologically enhanced defense. That was becoming increasingly clear as 1943 began to unfold. The first losses among the Type XB class came not as dramatic explosions, but as the slow realization that certain boats had simply failed to return. U-117, one of the first boats commissioned, disappeared in the waters south of Greenland in the spring of 1943, her fate uncertain for decades. Was she destroyed by an escort group? Did she fall victim to one of the growing number of anti-submarine aircraft now patrolling the trade routes? Did she encounter one of the British trawlers that had been converted into minesweepers and anti-submarine vessels? The records were often fragmentary, and the sea kept its secrets. The crews of the remaining Type XB boats would have felt this loss as a kind of phantom presence. On a long patrol, months away from the bases where rumors circulated and information slowly became known, the absence of a sister ship at a rendezvous point, the silence of a radio operator who should have transmitted a routine position report, these silences accumulated into a growing awareness that the waters were becoming less forgiving. The Atlantic, once seeming vast and endless, began to feel crowded with invisible threats. U-118 and U-119, among the first of the class to complete their trials, experienced increasingly violent encounters as they pushed deeper into their operational areas. Depth charge patterns became more frequent, more coordinated. The Allied convoy system, which had seemed almost chaotic in its early iterations, was becoming more disciplined, more lethal. Escort vessels were now trained to work in coordinated groups, their attacks orchestrated with growing sophistication. The depth charge itself, once a somewhat imprecise weapon that sent showers of shock waves through the water in rough patterns, was being deployed with greater accuracy as the operators gained experience and understanding of underwater acoustics. What happened to a crew when their boat was trapped in the depths by an active hunter-killer group? The boat would slide down into the darker layers of the ocean, perhaps 1,000 meters, perhaps more, seeking silence, seeking anything that might break the detection pattern. The engines would be cut to near zero, running on battery power, every unnecessary sound eliminated. In that darkness, in that profound quiet, the crews would sit motionless. A man who shifted his weight carefully might make the boat rock ever so slightly. The sound of a cup of coffee being poured, the creak of metal as the hull adjusted to pressure, these ordinary sounds became potential death sentences. Would they be heard? Would the hunting vessels above sense the movement and send down another pattern of charges? The psychological toll of these encounters was profound, though it was often expressed simply, almost matter-of-factly, in the few personal accounts that survived. One might speak of the trembling of the boat under repeated explosions, the way the lights would flicker and dim, the acrid smell of electrical fires that might break out in the narrow passages. The fear was not romantic or cinematic. It was visceral and claustrophobic. the terror of being trapped in a steel box hundreds of meters below the surface, while men above tried to crush it. As 1943 deepened into 1944, the losses accelerated. U-116 was destroyed in September 1943 by the British minesweeper HMS Sharpshooter, a vessel barely a fraction of the U-boat's tonnage, yet equipped with the right weapons and the right knowledge of where to look. U-119 was lost in November 1943, details uncertain, sunk somewhere in the dark waters she had been patrolling. U-233, one of the later boats in the class, was rammed and sunk by the British frigate HMS Sharpshooter in April 1944, a fate that seemed almost impossibly brutal, two vessels colliding in the violence of the hunt. Each loss was more than the sinking of a boat. It was the death of a crew. The Type XB boats carried 80 to 90 men. That meant 80 to 90 lives lost each time one went down. No boats came to pick them up from the frigid North Atlantic, or the English Channel, or whatever waters they had been patrolling. There would be no rescue, no return, no telling of tales. The sea accepted their sacrifice into its depths. The surviving boats adapted or attempted to. More time was spent submerged, which meant running on batteries, which meant lower speeds, which meant missions took longer, which meant the crews were at sea for extended periods with less ability to recharge and replenish. The balance between efficiency and survival became impossibly tight. Could you run fast enough to reach your objective and escape detection, yet slow enough to avoid making too much noise to betray your location? Could you surface enough to keep your batteries charged without offering yourself to the hunter-killers prowling above? These were the equations that the commanders had to solve, knowing that an error in calculation meant not just mission failure, but the death of everyone in the crew. The German Naval Command, observing these losses and the changing nature of the threat, began to shift the roles of the surviving Type XB boats. Pure mine-laying missions became riskier and less productive as the escort system improved and the number of available Type XB boats dwindled. The boats that survived would find themselves assigned to other duties, duties that kept them at sea, pushing them into the latter stages of a war that was increasingly lost. Yet still they went, because the order came, because the duty remained, because they were sailors in the Kriegsmarine, and discipline and duty were almost the only certainties left in a world that was falling apart. The waters off the coast of North Africa grew darker as evening fell in the autumn of 1943, and somewhere in that deepening blue, a Type XB boat, let us say it was U-116, though this particular moment belongs to several crews and several boats, their experiences threaded together by the same fear and the same quiet resolve, moved through the depths with deliberate silence. The diesel engines had been shut down hours before. Now only the battery-powered electric motors hummed, barely audible even to the men who lived beside them, a low thrumming that felt less like sound and more like the vessel's own heartbeat, steady and slow, and keeping time with the thoughts of 40 or 50 souls suspended in the darkness. The men knew, as men always do when danger approaches, that something was wrong. It was not something that could be heard through the hull or seen on any gauge. It was the particular quality of silence that comes when you are listening for something terrible, when every nerve has become attuned to the possibility of violence, when the normal rhythms of the boat, the shuffle of feet, the creak of joints, the soft clink of equipment, have all been stilled by the command passed down, absolute quiet. The order moves through the compartments not as words but as a tension, spreading like ripples through dark water, and every man understands what it means. Something has found you. Something knows you are there. In the conning tower, the captain stood motionless, his hand resting on the periscope shaft, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular because there was nothing to see in the darkness around them. The hydrophone operator sat hunched over his equipment, listening to the vast ocean through earphones, and what he heard was a distant thrashing, a rhythmic churning that grew gradually, almost imperceptibly, closer. Not one vessel but several, moving in a coordinated pattern. The Allied escort had picked up their scent. The order came without urgency in the voice. A captain's composure is the first thing his crew must believe in, to take the boat deeper, down through the layers of the sea, down past the point where the water began to compress the hull with a physical pressure you could almost feel, down into the realm where the darkness became complete and absolute. The dive was careful, methodical, a descent into a world where time moves differently, and fear becomes something that must be managed breath by breath. At depth, even the electric motors were a kind of liability. They were shut down. The boat hung in the water now, suspended, drifting with the current like a stone that has come to rest on some unfathomable bottom. Around them, the men began to understand that they were no longer moving, they were hiding. They were becoming invisible, or trying to, in the way that a hunted animal becomes invisible by ceasing to move, by blending into stillness, by becoming part of the landscape of danger itself. The waiting began, and waiting, as anyone who has experienced it knows, is a peculiar form of time. Minutes pass like hours. Hours compress into moments. A man's breath becomes audible to him in a way it never is on the surface. The beating of his own heart, which he normally never notices, becomes a sound that seems loud enough to give away his position to an enemy above. Some of the younger sailors, on their first patrol, on their first moment of true danger, had to fight against the urge to hold their breath, had to remind themselves that breathing was necessary, that the CO2 scrubbers would handle it, that quiet breathing was better than the panicked gasping that would come if they deprived themselves of air. The veterans, the men who had been through this before, sat with their eyes closed or fixed on the walls in front of them, thinking of their homes or of nothing at all, their minds deliberately emptied. The sound of the enemy above changed pitch. They were searching now with something more deliberate than sound, with instruments, with the strange mechanical ears of their detection equipment. The hydrophone operator's hand twitched as he adjusted the dial, trying to track the position of the approaching vessels. His lips moved almost imperceptibly as he whispered coordinates to the captain, his voice barely more than breath. And then it came, the first distant, dull thump that was not quite a sound, but rather a sensation, transmitted through the water and the hull into the very bones of the men suspended in the darkness. A depth charge had detonated somewhere in the vicinity, close enough to feel, far enough to allow thought. It was the first note of a symphony that no one wanted to hear, and it was followed by another and another, a series of distant concussions that seemed to bracket their position, drawing a circle around them, searching. The boat tilted slightly as the pressure waves pushed against it. A man's hand gripped the edge of a table. Someone's eyes opened wider. No one made a sound. This was not the time for sound. This was the time for becoming nothing, for making the boat a ghost, for erasing yourself from the world above so completely that the enemy would move on, would look elsewhere, would convince themselves that what they had detected was only the echo of their own searching, only the bounce of their own instruments coming back to them from empty water. The depth charges came closer. Now they were not distant thumps but actual concussions, hammer blows against the outside of the hull, and the boat lurched with each one. Lights flickered. Small items fell from shelves. The CO2 alarm, that high, terrible screech that no U-boat man ever wanted to hear, suddenly shrieked through the compartments, and men scrambled to silence it, hands moving quickly to reset the chemical scrubbers, to flood the affected compartments, to do whatever was necessary to stop that sound, because the sound was worse than the depth charges. The sound meant that they were failing, that the boat was being crushed, that the enemy above would keep coming if they knew that the boat was damaged. but it was silenced. The operator's hands steadied. Breathing resumed at that careful, measured pace. The next depth charge struck like thunder, and this time it was close enough that the men were thrown against the walls, close enough that pipes ruptured and seawater began to spray in a fine mist from the ceiling, close enough that for a moment, one impossible stretched moment, several of the men thought that this was it, that they were about to die suspended in the darkness, crushed or drowned or burned, or some combination of all three, and they felt the weight of that thought settle on them like fog. The captain's voice came then, steady as stone, giving orders. Plug that leak, balance the trim, maintain depth. The voice was a talisman, a reminder that there was still someone in command of events, that the boat was still intact, that survival was still possible. Men moved on instinct and training, their hands knowing what to do even as their minds spun in the chaos. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the depth charges grew more distant. The thuds became softer, the intervals between them grew longer. The circle of the search was widening. The enemy, uncertain, was moving away, looking elsewhere in the darkness, convinced perhaps that whatever they had found had slipped away or that nothing had been there at all. The silence that followed, when the last echo of the last explosion had faded into the depths, was a different kind of silence. It was not the tense, electric silence of preparation for violence. It was the silence of exhaustion, of survival, of a crisis that had passed. A man's shoulders slowly relaxed, another's hand unclenched from the edge of his bunk. The captain stood motionless for a moment longer, listening to the hydrophone operator's quiet voice, reporting that the escort vessels were now moving away at higher speed, heading in a different direction, searching a different patch of sea. No one spoke for several minutes after that. There was nothing to say. The danger was not entirely gone. It would not be gone for hours, but the immediate threat had receded. In the darkness of the boat, suspended in the darkness of the water, 40 or 50 men breathed quietly, feeling the weight of their own mortality settle around them like the pressure of the sea itself. And gradually, imperceptibly, the boat returned to something like normalcy. The diesel engines could not yet be restarted. It was too soon, too risky, but a man might move from one compartment to another now, without it being treated as an emergency. Water could be carefully bailed from the damaged section. Injuries could be assessed in whispered voices. The captain would eventually find his way to his cabin to study his charts and determine how best to retreat to deeper, safer waters. But for now, there was simply the presence of the boat around them, the knowledge that they had survived another moment of violence, and the quiet knowledge that somewhere out there, in the waters above and around them, other boats were searching, other men were hunting, and that this moment of terrifying silence, and then this moment of careful, precious relief, would come again before their patrol was finished. In the confined darkness of a Type XB's pressure hull, where steel walls curved close enough to touch from any bunk, the men developed rituals that became as essential as oxygen itself. These were not the grand ceremonies of naval tradition, but rather the quiet, repeated gestures that held fragile humanity intact when the world outside promised only cold and violence. A sailor might trace his finger along a photograph of his wife each morning before the watch bell rang, or hum the same few bars of a Munich folk song while checking the battery gauges in the compartment aft. These small acts were anchors in the darkness, reminders that beyond the U-boat's steel hull lay homes, families, ordinary lives that waited for their return. The mail that reached the boats, when it reached them at all, became treasure more valuable than any captured cargo. A letter from home, creased, perfumed with the faint scent of a sister's hair oil or the tobacco smoke from a father's study, could sustain a man for weeks in the crushing monotony of patrol. Chief Engineer Hans Iberken, who served aboard one of the later Type XB boats, kept a collection of letters bound with twine in his small locker, each one read so many times the paper had begun to tear at the folds. His wife wrote to him about the garden she was planting, about how their son had learned to read, about the ordinary rhythms of a life suspended in time. Ibukan would lie in his bunk for hours, rereading those letters in the thin yellow glow of the compartment light, his eyes moving slowly over the familiar words, as if by reading them carefully enough, he might step through the paper and back into that distant garden. The bonds between men in such an environment grew strange and profound. Confined in a space no larger than a city apartment, sharing air they had to consciously manage, eating food that grew increasingly monotonous as patrol weeks turned into months, a crew of 45 or 50 souls developed an almost telepathic understanding of one another. A torpedo officer might know, simply by the way his commanding officer moved through the control room, whether a decision to dive deeper or hold position had already been made. The men learned to move through the narrow corridors in a practiced choreography, sliding past one another sideways through doorways, their bodies learning the exact rhythm required to avoid collision in spaces where collision was inevitable if you moved carelessly. This constant proximity bred a kind of intimacy that many veterans later described as stranger than brotherhood, something closer to knowing another person's thoughts before they were spoken. One documented account, preserved in a private journal, describes how the crew of U-116 developed an elaborate system of jests and nicknames that carried their emotional weather. The first officer, universally known as Der Professor, earned his name not from any formal education, but from his habit of asking long, philosophical questions to pass the time during night watches. Questions about whether they would all survive, about what made a man brave, about whether courage was something you possessed, or something that appeared only in moments of absolute necessity. Another sailor, the radio operator, was called Der Schreiber, the scribe, because he kept notes about everything: the color of the sea on different days, the feel of the air in different compartments, the precise moment when a man's personality seemed to shift from hope to resignation. The men would sit together during rare moments of downtime, sharing tobacco rations and listening to Der Schreiber read passages from his journal, finding in those descriptions a kind of poetry that reminded them they were still alive, still capable of noticing beauty, even in a machine of war. Food held its own strange significance in the shipboard culture. The cook, who occupied one of the few positions with genuine status and affection among the crew, became something like a priest of hope. Early in patrol, when stores were fresh, he might conjure small miracles: a genuine onion in a stew, real butter for the bread, even occasionally a thin slice of sausage that suggested the kitchens of home. As weeks passed and the stores diminished, his role shifted. He became a magician tasked with disguising repetition, with making the same preserved fish taste marginally different through subtle manipulation of salt and whatever dried herbs remained in his tiny galley. One crew member who survived the war recalled that the best days were not those with the best food, but rather the days when the cook managed to produce a sweet, even something as simple as hard candy made from the last of the sugar rations, because the sweetness seemed to ease something in the men's souls, a reminder that pleasure still existed in the world. Letters that could not be sent, drafts written to wives or mothers with no certainty they would ever arrive, accumulated in men's bunks and personal lockers. There was something deeply human in this impulse to write words that might never be read, to speak across the void to people who did not yet know if they would ever hear from them again. A petty officer named Wilhelm from a small town in Saxony filled page after page of a small notebook with observations addressed to his unborn child, letters he hoped to give his wife to read to the baby someday, if he survived. His writing was careful, almost childlike in its simplicity. He wrote about the color of mist on the North Sea, about the sound diesel engines make when they're running smoothly, about the taste of the coffee they brewed in the early morning hours, about how men learned to laugh quietly so as not to disturb those trying to sleep in nearby compartments. These letters, these fragments of intimate thought, were the men's way of insisting that they were not just cogs in a military machine, not just anonymous operators of weaponry, but individual souls with individual lives that stretched backward into memory and forward into hope. The rituals surrounding sleep itself became almost sacred in their precision. Bunks on a Type XB were stacked 3 high, narrow as coffins, and the only privacy a man possessed was the privacy of his own exhaustion. A sailor would lie in his bunk and listen to the hum of the boat's systems, the electrical hum of the batteries, the steady pulsing of the hydraulic systems, the distant murmur of men in other compartments, and these sounds became a kind of lullaby, proof that the boat was functioning, that the crew was alive, that they remained submerged and unseen. Some men developed superstitions about their sleeping positions or the order in which they performed small tasks before sleep. One U-boat captain kept a photograph of his dog above his bunk and would touch it each night before attempting to rest. Whether he believed the gesture had protective power or whether it simply connected him to something warm and familiar beyond the submarine's hull, the officers never questioned. These beliefs were oxygen too, in their own way. The deeper meaning of these rituals and bonds becomes apparent when you understand that many of these men knew, with a knowledge that grew heavier as the war progressed, that they might not return home. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crewman, a statistic that emerges grimly in the historical record, was measured in mere years, and with each successive year of the war the odds declined further. And yet, the men continued to write letters, continued to share photographs, continued to hum songs and make jests, and drink weak coffee from chipped cups as if tomorrow was assured, as if this patrol would be like all the others, as if they would eventually surface one final time and return to the world beyond the steel. This particular form of courage, not the courage of the moment of combat, but the courage of continuing to be fully human in an inhuman place, of maintaining bonds and rituals and hope against all reasonable evidence, may have been the truest victory the Type XB's crews ever achieved. It lived on in the memories of those who survived, in the letters that were eventually delivered, in the journals that historians would one day read to understand not just the mechanics of war, but the texture of human endurance within it. And yet, for all its remarkable engineering, and the confidence it inspired in those who commanded it, the Type XB carried within its very design the seeds of a fundamental vulnerability. The same length and mass that granted it such extraordinary range and cargo capacity, that allowed it to venture farther into enemy waters than nearly any submarine before it, also made it a larger target in an ocean increasingly filled with listening ears and watchful eyes. The boat stretched over 140 meters from bow to stern, a length that, while impressive on the drawing boards of Germania Werft, became a liability in the waters where silence and invisibility meant survival. Consider the physics of detection in those years. The larger an object moving through water, the greater the disturbance it created, the more sound it produced, the broader the shadow it cast when radar beams swept across the surface. The Type XB's diesel engines, powerful enough to push such mass across vast distances, hummed and thrummed, with a signature that sensitive listening devices could eventually distinguish from the background noise of the sea. Allied hydrophones grew more sophisticated as the war deepened, learning to recognize the acoustic footprints of different German submarines, and the Type XB's distinctive rumble became in time an identifiable marker. Here comes one of the largest boats, the listeners might have thought, and with that recognition came the rapid scramble of depth charges and coordinated hunting tactics. The boat's displacement, nearly 2,000 tons when submerged, meant it displaced water with tremendous force. This created pressure waves, interference patterns in the ocean itself, Older, smaller U-boats had learned to hide by sitting perfectly still on the seafloor, becoming indistinguishable from geological features. The Type XB, however, required deeper water to rest safely, and its bulk made truly silent running difficult. When it descended noticeably. When it maneuvered with the turning radius of a ship, rather than the darting agility of smaller submarines. The captains who commanded these vessels understood this trade well. They gained range and capacity, but surrendered some of the nimbleness that had kept their smaller cousins alive. There was also the matter of the mine shafts themselves, those two vertical tubes running down the length of the boat, through which the naval mines were lowered into place, represented both the Type XB's unique capability and a structural weakness that perceptive observers might have recognized. The shafts added complexity to the hull, created potential points of weakness where the pressure hull had to be carefully engineered around these openings. They also altered the boat's hydrodynamic profile in subtle ways, introducing irregularities that, while not immediately obvious to casual inspection, could be detected by those studying the behavior of submarines under various conditions. In a sense, the very feature that made the Type XB special was also the feature that made it distinctive to enemy detection. As the war progressed and radar technology advanced, the Type XB's size became an even more pressing concern. The boat sat higher in the water than smaller submarines, presenting a larger profile to radar sweeps. When it had to run on the surface, and it did frequently need to, especially as fuel shortages made travel by diesel imperative, it became a more visible target to aircraft equipped with centimetric radar that could detect vessels from considerable distances. The crews knew this. The watch officers scanning the horizon through the periscope, the lookouts with their binoculars, the officers in the conning tower, they all understood that every moment spent on the surface was a moment of vulnerability, and the larger the boat, the sooner it might be spotted. Some historians have speculated, with measured caution, that the Type XB represented a design philosophy that had perhaps outlived its usefulness by the time the boats entered service. The original concept had been sound: create a mine layer with range enough to reach distant objectives, capacity enough to deliver significant mining operations far from German ports, and the capability to remain at sea for extended periods. But by the time U-1116 slipped into the Atlantic for her first mine-laying patrol, the surface of the ocean had changed. Convoys sailed with dedicated anti-submarine escorts. Aircraft with improved detection capabilities hunted the waters. Radar stations dotted the coastlines of Allied territory. The conditions that might have made a large, long-range mine layer a strategic asset had shifted beneath the very technology that embodied those ideals. The trade-offs, then, were as old as naval engineering itself. Every advantage purchased at the cost of another. The Type XB gained endurance but lost stealth. It gained striking power but sacrificed speed and agility. It gained the ability to carry supplies and conduct special missions but became harder to defend, requiring more careful tactics, more cautious approach to enemy waters, more reliance on luck and timing, and the growing unpredictability of enemy patrol patterns. The men aboard these boats understood this intuitively, if not always intellectually. They felt it in the sluggish response of the helm when evasive action became necessary, in the longer time it took to submerge, in the awareness that escape routes that might have worked for a Type VIC or a Type INXC might not suffice for their larger vessel. What made this vulnerability all the more poignant was the pride these boats inspired. The crew members spoke of the Type XB with respect, sometimes with affection. The boat was strong, well-built, capable. It could accomplish things that smaller submarines could not, and yet that strength was, in some fundamental way, also a kind of weakness, a vulnerability, masquerading as an asset. The men knew this, perhaps not consciously, not in ways they would have articulated to each other during the long watches below decks, but it manifested in a certain tenseness, a heightened awareness that their boat, for all its qualities, was not as hard to find as its designers might have hoped. The larger submarines of history have often carried this same paradox: greater capability coupled with greater risk, increased power balanced against reduced survivability. The Type XB embodied this tension perfectly, a boat that was simultaneously formidable and fragile, that could travel farther than its enemies expected, but could be seen sooner than its captains would have preferred. It was, in many ways, a design that asked the crews who served it to accept certain vulnerabilities in exchange for capabilities that the war would make increasingly difficult to utilize. And yet they accepted, and they sailed into waters that grew more dangerous with each passing month, knowing that their boat, remarkable as it was not invulnerable to the evolving defenses that waited for them. As the winter of 1944 turned towards spring, the Type XB boats that remained operational found themselves increasingly isolated, moving through waters that had grown perilously hostile. The Atlantic, once a vast frontier where they had operated with relative freedom, had transformed into a gauntlet of radar-equipped destroyers, roving escort groups, and aircraft that seemed to materialize from the fog without warning. The Kriegsmarine's operational strength had withered to a fraction of what it had been, and the remaining mine layers, those that had not already been sunk or captured, faced a fundamental question that had no pleasant answer. What was their purpose now, in a war that was plainly, irreversibly lost? U-116, the first of the great mine layers, had been lost in March of 1944, rammed and sunk by a British minesweeper in the Bay of Biscay after laying mines off Avonmouth. Her loss had reverberated through the U-boat arm, a reminder that size, range, and sophisticated mine-laying equipment meant nothing when detected and cornered by a determined enemy. U-117 had met her end 3 months earlier, torpedoed by the British submarine HMS Sharpshooter in the Atlantic. U-118, which had operated with some success early in her commissioning, had been damaged beyond repair in early 1944 and was eventually scuttled rather than allowed to fall into British hands. Each loss had carried away not only valuable tonnage and rare engineering expertise, but also the particular knowledge and muscle memory of crews who had trained together for months, whose understanding of their vessel's quirks and capabilities had become almost instinctive. By the spring of 1945, as Soviet forces pushed westward and American and British armies closed in from the west, the surviving Type XB boats faced an impossible situation. Continuing to operate meant almost certain death in combat. Remaining in port meant being captured or destroyed by Allied bombing raids. The U-boat pens themselves, those massive concrete fortresses that had seemed so permanent and impregnable in their construction, had become tombs waiting to be sealed. Some captains received orders from Berlin to continue patrols to the very end, a kind of pointless defiance that sent men to the bottom of the sea for no strategic gain whatsoever. Others received quiet, informal word that the war was ending and that discretion regarding one's vessel's final disposition might soon become a matter of personal choice rather than official mandate. U-219 and U-220, the later boats in the Type XB series, had been operating in increasingly desperate circumstances. U-219 had been commissioned relatively late in the war, and had seen only limited operational service, her planned mine-laying missions yielding diminishing returns as British minesweeping techniques improved, and the waters around Britain became progressively more dangerous. U-220 had spent considerable time on extended patrol, ranging far across the Atlantic in the hope of finding targets, often finding instead only empty ocean and the growing realization that the strategic situation was collapsing. Both boats faced the same grim calculus: return to a port that might soon be in enemy hands, or attempt to somehow fade into the Atlantic's vastness and hope to survive until the war's formal conclusion. The final months of the war in Europe saw a strange, unsettling transformation in the U-boat service. Orders from Berlin became increasingly inconsistent, sometimes contradictory, reflecting the confusion and desperation at the highest levels of command. Some captains received explicit instructions to surrender at the nearest neutral port. Sweden was mentioned frequently, as was Argentina, though reaching either was fantastically difficult from the North Atlantic in early 1945. Others were told to proceed to designated German ports and await further orders. Still others, picking up radio signals that grew progressively more garbled and apocalyptic, essentially received permission to use their own judgment, which meant in many cases a kind of weary resignation to whatever fate awaited them. The decision to scuttle a U-boat was not made lightly. These vessels represented extraordinary investments of time, material, and national pride. For a captain to deliberately sink his own command was, in some fundamental way, an admission of defeat that went beyond the formal military situation. It was a personal reckoning, a statement that the boat deserved dignity in her ending rather than being captured, dismantled, and studied by the enemy, her secrets dissected and catalogued. Some crews chose to scuttle their boats in the open ocean, setting explosive charges in the engine room or opening seacocks and watching from lifeboats as the vessel slipped beneath the surface. Others brought their damaged or non-operational boats to secluded inlets or remote harbours and sank them deliberately, hoping to deny them to the advancing Allies. U-233, one of the later Type XB boats, was scuttled by her crew in May 1945, just days before Germany's formal surrender. The men set demolition charges and abandoned her in a Norwegian fjord, watching in silence as she settled into the dark water. It was, perhaps, a small act of agency in a situation where agency had largely been stripped away. The boat that had been built with such care, that had represented the pinnacle of German mine-laying submarine design, that had carried men through months of tension and danger in the deep Atlantic, was consigned to the bottom not by enemy action, but by her own crew's deliberate choice. There was something quietly honourable in that, a final assertion of will in a war where will had long since ceased to matter. The larger narrative of these final months was one of gradual dissolution rather than dramatic collapse. Individual boats made their own decisions or followed the fragmented orders they received. Some surrendered in European ports. Kiel, Hamburg, and other U-boat bases that had been such centres of activity now became confused, overcrowded places where surrendering crews mixed with military personnel attempting to destroy records and cover evidence. A few boats attempted to break out for distant destinations, though the chances of reaching South America or the Far East in the summer of 1945 were vanishingly small. Most, in the end, remained in European waters, either captured or deliberately sunk by their crews. The transition from warfare to surrender was not instantaneous or clean. In the final weeks, individual U-boats operated in a kind of liminal space, no longer truly part of a coherent military force, but not yet formally surrendered. Captains intercepted radio messages that spoke of the collapse of German military command, of Allied armies entering German territory, of the imminent end of the regime. Some of these messages were clear enough, others were fragmentary or contradictory. The crews, for their part, seemed to move into a state of strange acceptance. After years of living with the knowledge that their vessels were essentially fragile, despite their size and sophistication, that a single aircraft, a single escort vessel, a single mistake in navigation could end everything, there was almost a kind of relief in the idea that the uncertainty might finally resolve itself. What happened to the Type XB boats that did not go down in combat or scuttle themselves varied widely. Some were taken by the British, some by the Americans, and a few by Soviet forces as they advanced westward. These captured vessels became subjects of intense technical scrutiny. The Allies were keenly interested in the Type XB's design innovations, its mine-laying mechanisms, its extended range and unique capabilities. British and American engineers examined every system, took careful measurements and photographs, and incorporated the insights they gained into their own submarine programs. For a brief moment after the war ended, the Type XB boats represented cutting-edge technology that might inform future naval strategy. That moment passed relatively quickly, as jet aircraft rendered submarines an increasingly marginal threat, and nuclear power began to revolutionize submarine design and capability. The quiet aftermath of May 1945 found the surviving Type XB boats scattered, disabled, or in the hands of the victors. No more mines would be laid in channels near the British Isles. No more crews would navigate by stars and dead reckoning through the waters off Portugal or the Bay of Biscay. The distinctive silhouettes of these massive mine layers, longer and broader than most other U-boats, would be seen only in repair yards or captured ship registries. The peculiar combination of features that had made them unique, the vertical mine shafts, the extended range, the sophisticated torpedo armament, now served only as historical artifacts, evidence of a particular moment in submarine design and naval warfare. The end of service for the Type XB boats was, in many ways, quiet. There were no grand final patrols, no legendary last stands. There were surrenders and scuttlings, decisions made in confusion or resignation, crews stepping off vessels they had come to know intimately and wondering what would come next. There was the strange mixture of relief and loss that comes when a long struggle finally ceases, when the necessity for constant vigilance and decision-making dissolves, leaving behind only the weight of what had been endured and what had been lost. The boats themselves sank or were towed into captivity. Their service ended not with the drama their size and capability might have suggested, but with the particular exhaustion of the very end of war. The spring of 1945 arrived like a tired breath drawn across the Atlantic. By then, the Type XB minelayers that had haunted Allied shipping lanes for years were themselves hunted creatures, their survival measured not in victories but in the distance they could travel before detection. U-234 was among the last to remain operational, and her final voyage would become, in many ways, the most consequential of all the Type XB boats. In early April, as the Third Reich crumbled around Berlin, U-234 received orders that seemed almost dreamlike in their secrecy, even by submarine standards. She was to make a journey across the Atlantic, not as a minelayer or even as a combatant, but as a courier. Her cargo was unlike anything these large boats typically carried. Tucked into her hull were technical documents, blueprints, samples of rare materials, and perhaps most significantly, 2 Japanese naval officers and a German scientist who specialized in aeronautical design. The destination was Tokyo. Think about what that means. In April of 1945, with Germany already signing surrender documents, there were still men in the Reich who believed that knowledge could be transported across an ocean through waters dominated by American destroyers and aircraft, as if faith alone might keep a U-boat invisible. The boat's commanding officer was Kapitänleutnant Johann Reisman, a pragmatic sailor who understood the odds were not favorable. By this late stage of the war, U-boats did not journey the Atlantic. They rarely left port at all. The waters had become so thoroughly patrolled, so layered with sonar and aircraft radar, that any boat attempting a transatlantic crossing was essentially asking the sea for a miracle. And yet orders were orders. Reisman and his crew prepared the U-234 for what would be one of the strangest voyages of the entire war. The boat departed from the Norwegian port of Bergen, moving northward initially through waters that, while dangerous, offered a measure of cover. Reisman's strategy was one of patience and extreme caution. He would run submerged during daylight hours, surface only briefly at night to ventilate the boat and recharge batteries, and maintain the slowest possible speed that still allowed forward progress. The crew settled into routines they knew well by then. The diesel engines would hum their familiar song when surfaced, that deep, almost meditative drone that U-boat men had heard thousands of times. Below the surface came the near-total silence broken only by the faint hiss of the air circulation systems and the careful, quiet footfalls of men trying not to disturb each other in spaces so confined that solitude was impossible. But something changed in early May. Perhaps Reisman had already heard rumors of Germany's surrender, or perhaps the radio operators received the news in coded messages. The war that had consumed nearly 6 years of their lives was ending. Germany was finished. The Third Reich no longer existed. What did it mean, then, to continue across an ocean, carrying documents and cargo meant for a nation still fighting? What was the purpose of secrecy and evasion when everything they had served was dissolving into history? It was not a mutiny, or even a conscious decision by the crew. It was something quieter, a shift in purpose. U-234 continued northward, away from the transatlantic route that might have brought detection and destruction. She remained submerged more deeply, in colder waters, with her crew existing in a kind of liminal space between surrender and continuation. The boat's stores of food gradually diminished. The batteries required constant maintenance. The men moved through their days with the weight of uncertainty pressing down like the ocean itself. By the time U-234 surfaced near the Grand Banks of Newfoundland in May, the decision had been made. Reisman had concluded that the voyage to Japan was no longer possible, and perhaps no longer meaningful. The boat's crew voted, which was itself an extraordinary act in a military that did not operate on democratic principles. The vote was nearly unanimous. They would surrender to the Americans rather than face the near-certain prospect of being sunk, or spend the remaining years of their lives as prisoners of war after months in transit. It was a choice born of exhaustion and clarity, the kind of decision that only comes after years of fear and confinement. The surrender was handled with the precision that characterizes such transitions in naval warfare. U-234 flew a white flag. American destroyers approached. The crew emerged from the hull, blinking in the cold Newfoundland air. Men who had been underground in metal and darkness for weeks. They were taken into custody with the courtesy that typically attends the capture of a military vessel that has come to the end of its service. But then came the discovery, and it was there that U-234's final voyage truly became part of history in a way that nothing else these Type XB boats had accomplished. When American naval personnel boarded the U-234 and began cataloging its contents, they found something that would raise questions for decades to come. There were technical documents related to German jet aircraft. There were blueprints. There were samples of rare materials. There were 2 Japanese naval officers, as expected. And then there was the German scientist, Dr. Heinz Schlicker, who specialized in advanced weaponry and aeronautical design. But beneath all of that, or perhaps woven through it, there were other materials. The historical record becomes somewhat obscure here, partly by design and partly simply because the passage of time has made certainty difficult. There were suggestions, never fully confirmed but never entirely dismissed, that U-234 carried radioactive materials. Some accounts mention uranium compounds. Other sources are more vague, speaking only of special materials or cargo of extraordinary strategic significance. Whether U-234 carried uranium for a Japanese atomic bomb program, or materials meant to advance German rocketry, or something else entirely, remains one of those questions where history and speculation intertwine in ways that no declassified document has ever fully resolved. What is certain is that American intelligence officers recognized immediately that this boat and its cargo represented something beyond the ordinary capture of a military vessel. The materials were segregated, the Japanese officers were separated from the crew. The documents were examined with intense interest. The boat itself was studied with meticulous attention to its design, its capabilities, its construction. The crew of U-234, for their part, remained largely unaware of the historical significance of their surrender. They were processed as prisoners of war. Some of them would spend years in captivity. Others were eventually repatriated to Germany. They had survived when so many other U-boat crews had not, and yet their survival carried a particular weight, because they had carried cargo whose true nature and significance seemed to shift slightly depending on which account one read. The Type XB Minelayers had been conceived as weapons of extraordinary ambition, boats large enough and capable enough to project German power across oceans. U-234 represented the final chapter of that ambition, but in a form no one had quite anticipated. It was not sunk by a depth charge or hunted into the abyss. It was surrendered by a crew that understood the war was over, that continuing was futile, that the cargo they carried, whatever it truly was, would never reach its destination. The boat that had been designed to outlast and outreach other submarines had instead become a messenger carrying secrets that would outlive the war itself. What remains is the question that hovers over U-234 even now, more than 75 years later. What exactly was in that hull during that final voyage across the Atlantic? The documents released over the decades offer pieces of the answer, but never the whole truth. Perhaps that is fitting, in a way. The Type XB Minelayers had always been creatures of secrecy, designed in defiance of treaties, constructed in hidden shipyards, their operations cloaked in silence. U-234's final mystery is simply an echo of everything that came before it. The wreck of the Type XB now rests in waters where few humans ever venture, preserved in the cold embrace of the deep. And in those silent depths lies a kind of answer to questions historians have asked for decades. What was this boat really? An engineering marvel or an expensive gamble? A symbol of German technical ambition, or a cautionary tale about building too large when speed and stealth might have served better? The answer, in the quiet way of history, is perhaps both, and this duality is precisely why the Type XB has never faded from the memory of those who study submarine warfare. Naval historians approach the Type XB with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. There is no denying the audacity of its conception. A submarine displacing over 2,000 tons, stretched to more than 80 meters, carrying enough mines to strew an entire shipping lane with deadly geometry. It represented a radically different philosophy from the sleek, predatory U-boats that prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchantmen one at a time. The Type XB was not designed to be a wolf. It was designed to be a layer of traps, a silent engineer of catastrophe. And yet, as the war progressed, and as Allied technology advanced faster than anyone in the Kriegsmarine had anticipated, that very size, that impressive displacement and that distinctive profile became a vulnerability rather than an asset. The historians who have written most thoroughly about the Type XB in recent decades tend to place it in a particular category of World War II weapons, the technically sophisticated solution to a problem that had already shifted. By the time these boats began their operational voyages, the Battle of the Atlantic had already entered a phase where surface raiding was becoming suicide, and where the acoustic signature of a massive submarine could betray it across distances that earlier generations of sonar operators could only have dreamed of detecting. The mines themselves remained lethally effective, certainly, but the boats that laid them had to survive long enough to reach the target areas, and survival was becoming increasingly difficult. Yet there is something almost noble in how historians now regard the crews of these boats. Whether the Type XB was ultimately an effective weapon or not, seems almost beside the point to many scholars who have studied the personal accounts that survive. These men volunteered or were assigned to serve in submarines that were, by virtue of their size, marginally slower to dive than smaller U-boats. They knew, in the way that crews always seem to know, that their chances were not favorable, and still they went. There is a kind of quiet recognition in historical scholarship, a gentleness in how the Type XB is discussed, that acknowledges this reality without sensationalizing it. The wreck divers who have explored the remains of these boats in recent years have brought a different kind of knowledge to the question of the Type XB's legacy. These are men and women who descend into crushing darkness, where the water is so cold that exposure would bring unconsciousness in minutes, and where the light from their lamps reveals the actual physical form of these boats as they rest on the seabed. What they find in those depths speaks in a language that transcends historical debate. The vertical mine shafts, now empty, still visible in the structure, the torpedo tubes, silent, the observation ports through which officers once scanned hostile skies, the torpedo compartments where men slept in shifts, where photographs of wives and children were thumbtacked to the steel walls, where letters were written to be mailed if the boat should return. Wreck divers speak often of a peculiar melancholy that comes with exploring a submarine. There is an intimacy to it, a house-sized hole in the ocean floor that once contained a complete world, a place where men lived, worked, ate, slept, and died. The Type XB wrecks, in particular, seem to inspire a certain reflectiveness in those who study them. Perhaps it is the sheer scale of the boats. Perhaps it is something in the known stories of their fates. Perhaps it is simply the weight of history pressing down through several hundred meters of water. The engineering itself, divorced from its military purpose, is genuinely impressive. Historians of submarine design trace the evolution of the mine-laying boat through the First World War's UE class and into the more sophisticated designs of the interwar period. And the Type XB represents something like the apotheosis of that lineage, a boat so large and so capable of carrying so much payload that it essentially redefined what a mine layer could be. In naval engineering circles, the Type XB is studied not as a failed experiment, but as an example of how far designers could push the concept before encountering practical limits. It is a reference point, a marker on the timeline of submarine development, pointing toward possibilities that later navies would explore in their own ways. The Russians, after the war, paid careful attention to captured Type XB specifications when developing their own submarine fleet. The concept of the large, long-range mine-laying submarine did not die with the last German boats. It was transformed, reinterpreted, adapted. In this way, the Type XB became part of the foundation of Cold War naval design, a ghost in the lineage of boats that would later patrol beneath the Arctic ice. Historians sometimes note, with the kind of wry appreciation that only comes with sufficient distance, that Germany's most ambitious submarine design achieved a certain immortality not through operational success, but through its influence on the designs of the very nations that defeated it. There is also something poignant in how the Type XB is remembered by those who seek to preserve submarine history in Germany itself. The U-995, a Type Vic boat, survives as a museum in Labo, where tens of thousands of visitors each year walk through the narrow corridors and emerge with a visceral understanding of what submariners endured. The Type XB boats no longer have that surface presence. They rest in deep water, known to researchers and enthusiasts but absent from public memory, in the way that preserved ships are present. This absence, this loss, gives the Type XB a kind of poignancy. It is history that must be reached for, that requires effort and study, and the special knowledge of wreck divers to fully appreciate. As the years pass, and as World War II recedes further into the past, the Type XB becomes less a weapon and more a symbol of ambition, of technical striving, of the strange fate that leaves some things glorified and remembered while others sink, quite literally, out of sight. Future historians will likely revisit the Type XB again and again, finding new interpretations, new angles of analysis, new ways of understanding what it meant and what it accomplished. The boats themselves, meanwhile, will continue their slow descent into the mist of deep time, their steel frames becoming home to creatures that neither know nor care that humans once lived and worked within them, and perhaps that is, in the end, a kind of peace, a forgetting that is also a release. The North Sea harbour lies in stillness now, the way only water and absence can create silence. The mist that rolled across those steel hulls at dawn has returned with evening, softer this time, diffused through the pale remains of daylight. There are no engines turning below the surface anymore. There are no men in those narrow corridors, checking gauges, whispering reports through speaking tubes, waiting for the order to dive. The pens themselves, those vast concrete cathedrals where the Type XB boats once rested between missions, stand empty and nearly forgotten, worn smooth by decades of salt wind and indifference. What remains is memory, held in the quiet way that harbours remember. The water laps against the same stone walls it touched 70, 80 years ago. The air still carries the ghost of diesel fuel and fresh paint, and the particular metallic smell of a submarine at rest. A visitor walking those docks today would find plaques and photographs, the careful inscriptions of historians trying to hold on to a story that the sea itself seems content to let go. Some visitors come to remember the engineering brilliance, the audacity of designing a boat so large, so capable, so impossibly ambitious. Others come to think about the men who served in those hulls and what it must have felt like to live in such profound confinement, knowing that a single mistake, a single sound at the wrong moment, could mean the difference between home and the ocean floor. The Type XB boats themselves, those remarkable vessels that seemed almost too large to be submarines at all, are mostly gone now. Some were sunk by Allied depth charges in the final months of the war, their hulls collapsing under pressure as they dove beyond their limits, desperate and surrounded. Others were scuttled by their own crews when it became clear that the Reich itself was sinking, and there seemed some small dignity in choosing the moment of your own boat's death rather than waiting for an enemy shell or torpedo. A few made it through to the end, only to be towed into shallow water and broken apart, their steel melted down, their secrets dismantled, their stories reduced to archival photographs and the fading recollections of the men who survived. U-234, that extraordinary boat that carried so much weight in its cargo hold, was raised from the Atlantic and later scuttled herself, deliberately sent to the bottom in deep water off the coast of Nova Scotia in 1946. One might wonder what impulse guided that decision, whether it was meant as a kind of mercy, letting her sink on terms rather than rot on a dock, or whether it was simply practical, an old boat no longer useful, becoming no longer worth maintaining. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between those speculations, obscured by time and the classified documents that remain classified still. The men themselves, if any are still alive, are quite old now. Those who crewed the Type XB boats during the closing years of the war would be well into their 90s, their memories of those voyages taking on the quality of dreams, vivid in some moments, hazy in others. Some never spoke about their experiences, others wrote memoirs, gave interviews, tried to put into words what it had felt like to live in an iron tube while the world outside tried to kill you. They described the sound of the engines, a constant, almost meditative hum that you learn to hear as a kind of silence. They speak of the peculiar intimacy of serving with the same dozen or so men for months at a time, knowing their habits, their fears, their quiet strengths. They remember the smell of food cooked in a galley the size of a closet, the way everything, your clothes, your skin, your hair, absorbed the smell of the boat itself, a scent you couldn't escape even when you closed your eyes. The officers who commanded those boats, men with names that appear in the naval histories, are now only names. They have their photographs in archives, they have their service records, their patrol reports, their official commendations and, in some cases, their court-martial documents from the post-war tribunals. We know what they did, the broad outlines of their decisions and their fates. What we cannot fully know is what they thought in the darkness of a U-boat, miles beneath the surface, waiting for a sonar ping to become something worse. What did they remember of home? What bargains did they make with themselves to justify the morning? These questions have no answers, not anymore. The sea does not keep records. It takes what it takes and holds on to nothing. The harbour at dusk cannot tell us these things. It can only show us the space where those boats once were, the absence that is perhaps a kind of presence, the way that gone things sometimes feel more real than the living present. The last light is draining from the western sky now, leaving behind a palette of greys and pale blues, and deep purples that seem less like colour than like the memory of colour. The water reflects none of it. The water, as always, is dark beneath the surface, fathomless and patient. A few seabirds wheel overhead, calling to each other with voices that sound almost like sonar, that click and echo that the submariners knew so well. They have no knowledge of the history below them. They have no knowledge of the engineering and ambition and fear that once moved through these waters. This is perhaps the way it should end, not with drama or tragedy or the thunderous closure of narrative, but with the quiet settling of dusk, the acceptance that great things pass, that even the largest submarines eventually become small in comparison to the ocean that holds them. The Type XB boats, those remarkable creations of German